This night, we journey together to New Kingdom Thebes as the floodwaters begin to rise in the season of Akhit. The Nile has begun to swell at Elephantine, its waters brown with silt carried from the mountains of Ethiopia. In the village of Deir el-Medina, on the west bank at Thebes, a tomb painter named Ka wakes before dawn to walk the path to the Valley of the Kings, where he will work by lamplight on a royal tomb, though in reality, artisans typically prepared tombs for reigning pharaohs who were very much alive. You are standing at the harbor at Elephantine, and the first light of mid-July is spreading across the granite boulders that mark Egypt's southern frontier. The Nile, which the ancient Egyptians called simply Ita, W or asterisk, I letter 1 EAF TR a W, meaning river, stretches northward for approximately 650 kilometers, and is often considered the longest river on Earth. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of Nubian gold and incense with unusual haste this morning, for the rising of Sirius, which the Egyptians named Sopdet, has been sighted in the eastern sky, and the priests of Khnum have already begun their watch at the Nilometer. The cool air moves across your face, carrying the particular mineral scent of granite heated through the night, and now cooling in the grey dawn, and somewhere to the south, beyond the cataracts, the seasonal rains in the Ethiopian highlands and East African tropics have begun their slow, inevitable translation into moving water. You follow the marked staircase downward to the Nilometer, an important structure for monitoring the Nile's flood levels, as a priest records the morning measurement in his wax tablet. The marks cut into the stone walls show where the water stood yesterday, last week, last year at this same turning of the stars. And now, the new line sits a finger's width higher than any summer measurement in the collected memory of the temple. Hapuseneb does not speak as he works, but his assistant, a younger man called Ipai, has already prepared the runner who will carry word north to Thebes, to Memphis, to the Delta itself. For the Inundation, the season the Egyptians call Akhit, has begun its annual return. The Egyptian year was divided into 3 seasons based on the Nile cycle: Akhit for the inundation, Peret for the emergence and growing, and Shemu for the harvest. You climb back to the temple courtyard, where the visual of dark brown water carrying debris meets your eyes. Palm fronds torn from southern groves, the occasional animal carcass of a goat or antelope caught in the first surge, and glinting among the churning mass, the odd piece of Nubian gold that has shaken loose from some merchant's carelessly secured cargo. The Nile is the only river that completely crosses the Sahara, and in doing so it carries water and sediment from much of northeastern Africa toward the Mediterranean Sea. The smell of wet earth and rotting vegetation as the flood spreads over dry ground reaches you even here, above the normal waterline, for the river is breathing outward, exhaling moisture into air that has known only dust for months. The coolness of water where there had been only dust for months touches your ankles as you descend to the landing stage, and a fisherman passing in his reed boat calls out that the frogs have begun their chorus 3 nights early, their bodies sensing through some ancient mechanism what human observation confirms only by instruments. The runner departs at mid-morning, a lean man named Karamweset, who will cover the distance to Thebes in 4 days of steady jogging, and you watch him diminish along the riverbank road until he becomes indistinguishable from the heat shimmer rising from the Desert, the red land of the desert that surrounds the fertile Kemet and provides stone, minerals, and burial grounds. The Desert stretches east and west in waves of ochre and rust, lifeless, pitiless, the boundary against which all Egyptian civilization presses and defines itself. The Nile's annual flood deposited black silt, known as Kemet, or the Black Land, which supported agriculture along its banks, and this transformation has been central to Egyptian civilization for thousands of years. In Coptic, the language of Christian Egypt that would not fully develop for another 1,000 years, but whose roots were already present in the spoken dialects of the south. The river was called Pharaoh, a term later associated with Pharaoh, the king who was identified with the river's life-giving power. You take passage on a grain barge moving north with the current, and the captain, a heavy man named Nakhemin, explains that his cargo of emmer wheat from last year's Shemu must reach the storage silos at Karnak before the basin fills beyond navigation. Already the crew are poling with greater effort against currents that strengthen hourly. The sound of frogs, suddenly everywhere, their chorus rising at dusk, follows the barge as the banks recede and the floodplain begins its slow submersion. Children released from field labor play in the unexpected lakes forming between villages, and you see them from the deck, brown limbs flashing in the brown water, their voices carrying across the widening surface with a particular quality of echo that open water produces. The children have been released from the fields because there are no fields now, only the advancing lake of Akhit, and their play is the play of sudden, unexpected holiday, of liberation from the hoeing and weeding that Perrot will demand of them in its time. The barge passes a village where the flood's height is being measured at a nilometer, and you observe a farmer and his wife standing ankle-deep at the base of their own mud brick house, which sits on a slight rise that has become, in the last 2 days, an island. The taste of anxiety in the throat of a farmer whose house is lower than his neighbor's is visible in the man's posture, the tightness of his shoulders, the frequency with which he turns to measure his threshold against the climbing water. His wife carries their youngest child on her hip, and 2 older children cling to her linen skirt, their faces turned toward the strange new sea that has replaced their dooryard. The neighbor's house, you notice, sits perhaps 3 handbreadths higher, a difference planned or accidental that now determines whether a family sleeps dry or wakes swimming. The flood reached its peak in September and October, sometimes covering the entire floodplain to a depth of 5 meters, and this measurement, this one. 5 meters is the difference between prosperity and catastrophe, between the full granary and the empty belly. A good flood covered the fields sufficiently. A bad flood meant famine and tax relief, and the calculation of good and bad belongs not to the farmer, but to the priests who read the nilometers, to the vizier who assesses the harvest tax, to the pharaoh who is the river, and the river who is the pharaoh. The canals and basins were used to control and distribute floodwater across fields, and you see the evidence of this ancient engineering as the barge passes stone sluice gates that direct the rising water into predetermined channels, transforming random inundation into managed irrigation. The floodwaters receded by December, leaving behind saturated soil ready for planting, and this recession too is managed, controlled, anticipated, the entire agricultural year structured around the rivers coming and going. At Karnak, you disembark into a city transformed by anticipation, for the word from Elephantine has arrived by runner, by signal fire, by the simple observation of any farmer who wakes to find the first water seeping through his floor. The farmer at Karnak wakes to the sound of water lapping at new levels, checks the nilometer marks, and this particular farmer, a man named Painab who works land belonging to the Temple of Ammon, has built his sleeping platform high enough to escape the first rise, but not, he suspects, the ultimate reach of the inundation season. You find him at the temple nilometer in the hour before noon, a tall man with the thickened forearms of the ploughman, standing with Hapuseneb's counterpart, the priest Amenemope, as they compare the Karnak measurement against the reported figure from Elephantine. The reading from Elephantine travels north with the urgency of military intelligence, for upon this number depends the taxation of the coming year, the distribution of stored grain, the very stability of the state. Painab returns to his holding by mid-afternoon, and you accompany him through streets where the water has advanced to the level of doorsteps, where household goods are being carried to upper rooms, where the smell of wet earth and rotting vegetation as the flood spreads over dry ground has become the dominant atmosphere of the city. Paynab's house, you see, sits lower than his neighbors by perhaps the height of a water jar, and the taste of anxiety in the throat of a farmer whose house is lower than his neighbor's is present in his silence, in the set of his jaw as he measures the water against his threshold with a marked stick. The children of Karnak have been released from the fields as the children of Elephantine were released, and Paynab's own sons, 2 boys of perhaps 8 and 10 years, are playing in the water that surrounds their house, diving from the roof of the grain store into the unexpected lake that has formed between their holding and the temple wall. Their shouts carry across the water with the particular quality of echo that you noticed earlier, the sound of voices bouncing from mud brick walls that have become, temporarily, the shores of an inland sea. You spend the evening in Paynab's upper room, where the family has moved their sleeping mats and cooking brazier, and through the small window you watch the darkness gather over the water that has replaced their courtyard. The island shrinks nightly as the water rises, the circumference of dry ground diminishing with each measurement, each report from the Nilometer, each observation of the stars that track Sopdit's rising. Paynab recites the division of the year to his children as a kind of lullaby, a reminder that Akhit passes, that Perit follows, that the pattern holds. The Nile, which the ancient Egyptians call simply Ita, W or asterisk, I letter 1 EAF, TR a W, meaning merely river, has been performing this pattern since before the first temple, before the first pharaoh, before the first marked stone recorded its height. In the darkness, the frogs reach their full volume, and their chorus becomes the sound of the night itself, a continuous vibration that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the water, from the air, from the mud brick walls that absorb and transmit their frequencies. You lie on your mat and listen to Paynab's breathing, to his wife's quieter respiration, to the occasional movement of the children in their corner, and beneath all these human sounds, the larger sound of the river, the Ita. W, the Pharaoh, the Nile, moving northward through the darkness with its cargo of silt and debris, and the odd piece of Nubian gold that will lodge in some farmer's field to be found in Shemu, a small fortune, a gift of the flood. The morning brings word from the south, from Hapuseneb at Elephantine, that the rise continues at the expected rate, neither the catastrophic surge of legend nor the disappointing trickle that means hunger. The inundation typically began in mid-July at Elephantine, near the southern border of Egypt, with the rising of Sirius, which the Egyptians named Sopdit, heralding the flood, and this pattern continued year after year, largely independent of human efforts to predict or influence it. You walk with Paynab to the temple precinct, where a Menemope is directing the movement of last year's grain from the lower storage chambers to platforms constructed above the expected flood line. The temple's own barges, larger and more numerous than any private holding, require correspondingly more preparation. The visual of dark brown water carrying debris is visible even in the sacred enclosure, where the flood has penetrated to the base of the first pylon, where priests wade through water to reach their morning rituals. The priest at the temple of Khnum at Elephantine records the first rise, sends word north by runner, and that word has now reached Karnak, has been interpreted, has become the basis for action. The reading of this morning, passed from runner to runner, from signal station to signal station, has determined that the temple will move its grain, that the city will prepare its higher ground, that the pattern of Akhit will proceed with the regularity that 3,000 years of observation have established. The Nile is approximately 650 km long, making it the longest river on Earth, and this length, this immense reach from the Ethiopian highlands to the Mediterranean, is the body of which Egypt is the shadow, the reflection, the dependent life. You return to Painab's house as the afternoon heat reaches its maximum, and the water has risen to cover the lowest step of his doorway, the step that his grandfather cut, that his father maintained, that he himself has repaired with fresh mud each year after Shemu's harvest. His wife has already moved the cooking brazier to the highest corner of the upper room, has stacked their household gods on a platform she constructed in the night, has done the 1,000 small preparations that transform a house into a fortress against the water. The children, released from the anxiety of their parents by the simple resilience of childhood, have constructed a raft of papyrus reeds and are poling it in circles around their diminishing island, their voices carrying across the water with the particular quality of echo that you have come to recognize as the acoustic signature of Akit. Their play is the play of adaptation, of finding the possibility for joy in circumstances that constrain and transform. As the light begins to soften, you climb to the roof with Painab, and from this elevation you can see the extent of the transformation that 2 days of rising water have produced. The Kemet, the black land, has become truly black, saturated with water, its surface reflecting the evening sky in patches where the inundation lies deep and still. The Deseret, the red land, begins at the visible horizon, the boundary between fertile and barren, between life and death, between the possible and the impossible. The Nile's annual flood deposited black silt, the Kemet, or the black land, that made agriculture possible in the desert. And this deposit, this annual gift, is the reason for the house on the slight rise, for the children on the reed raft, for the priest at the Nilometer, for the runner on the riverbank road, for all the complex human activity that the river makes possible and necessary. You stand with Painab and watch the darkness gather, and the visual of dark brown water carrying debris becomes less distinct, becomes impression, becomes the simple fact of moving water where there was stillness, of sound where there was silence, of life where there was the suspended animation of Shemu's dryness. The frogs begin their chorus as the last light leaves the sky, and their sound fills the world with a vibration that seems to come from the water itself, from the mud, from the very air that has been transformed by moisture. Painab descends to his family, to the upper room where they will sleep in their displaced arrangement, and you remain on the roof, watching the stars emerge in their slow progression, waiting for the rising of Sirius, of Soptit, the herald of the flood that has already begun. Inundation typically began in mid-July at Elephantine, the southern border of Egypt, with the rising of Sirius, which the Egyptians named Soptit, heralding the flood, and this typical beginning, this astronomical precision, is the framework within which all the particular events of this particular year will unfold, the pattern that contains and explains the individual anxiety of Painab, the individual observation of Hapuseneb, the individual journey of Karamweset the runner. The Nile is the only river that completely crosses one of the subtropical dry zones, the Sahara, and in this crossing, in this defiance of geographical probability, it creates the possibility of Egypt itself, of the Kemet, of the 3 seasons, of the Nilometer and the marked staircase, and the priest who records the morning level. The river's waters come primarily from the seasonal rains in the Ethiopian highlands and East African tropics, and these rains, falling on ground you have never seen, ground that exists for you only as report, as rumor, as the explanation for what arrives at your feet, are the ultimate source of all you observe, all you will observe, all that makes observation possible. This length is the distance between the rain and the silt, between the cause and the effect, between the origin and the destination that is also, in the circular logic of agriculture, the origin again. In Coptic, the language of Christian Egypt that will not exist for another 1,000 years, but whose roots are already present in the spoken dialects of the south, the river was called Pharaoh, the origin of Pharaoh, And this naming, this etymology, is the key to understanding the Egyptian world. The river and the king and the river, the human and the divine, all flowing together in the single channel of the Ita. W, the asterisk I letter 1 EAFTR a W, the simply river. The night deepens, and the chorus of frogs gradually simplifies, individual voices dropping away as the temperature falls, as the biological urgency of amphibian reproduction meets the physical limits of cold-blooded metabolism. You lie on the roof, on a mat that Painab has provided, and the stars move in their slow wheel above you, the same stars that Hapuseneb observes at Elephantine, that Karamweset the runner observed on his journey north, that the pharaoh observes in his palace at Thebes, the same stars, the same sky, the same pattern that contains and is contained by the river. The visual of dark brown water carrying debris is replaced by darkness, by the simple fact of water where there was land, of movement where there was stillness, of sound where there was silence. The sound of frogs has reduced now to isolated calls, individual voices marking territory, seeking mates, continuing the biological imperative that the flood has made possible. You breathe the smell of wet earth and rotting vegetation as the flood spreads over dry ground, and the breath itself is part of the pattern, the exchange of gases that mirrors the exchange of water, the circulation that connects the individual body to the larger body of the world, the river, the Kemet, the Deseret, the sky with its slow wheel of stars. The Nilometer at Elephantine was one of the most important for predicting the flood's extent, and its reading of this morning, of yesterday morning, of all the mornings back through the collected records of the temple of Khnum, is part of the knowledge that makes prediction possible, that transforms the unpredictable into the expected, the terrifying into the manageable. The flood's height was measured at Nilometers, marked staircases or wells that recorded water levels, and these marks, these accumulated inscriptions, are the memory of the river, the way that it speaks across time, that its pattern becomes knowable, predictable, usable for human purpose. The night moves toward its deepest point, the hour before dawn when the body most craves sleep, when the mind most easily releases its hold on the particular, the individual, the anxious self that measures water against doorsteps. The stars wheel overhead, and the first hint of dawn begins to soften the eastern sky, the same dawn that you observed at Elephantine, that Hapuseneb observed, that Karamweset the runner observed on his journey, the same light returning to mark another day of Akhit, another measurement, another stage in the annual transformation. The world holds its breath in the hour before dawn, the coolest hour, the deepest hour, the hour when sleep comes most easily to those who have learned to trust the pattern, to release their hold on the particular, to float as the papyrus raft floats, as the debris floats, as the odd piece of Nubian gold floats, carried by forces larger than individual will, larger than individual fear, larger than the anxiety that measures water against doorsteps and fines, in the measurement, the possibility of rest. You are standing at the edge of the floodplain, where the black land meets the red land in a line so sharp it might have been drawn by a surveyor's rope. Around you, the last pools of floodwater evaporate into a pale mist that rises without wind, that hangs above the earth like breath exhaled slowly. The crack of dried mud underfoot marks each step you take across terrain that has transformed from liquid to solid in the weeks since the waters began their retreat. Kemet, the black land, stretches before you, rich with silt that the river has carried from far upstream, from Nubia, from the highlands where rain falls in seasons unknown to this valley. Deseret, the red land, rises beyond, the desert that has never known the flood's embrace, that waits in eternal patience for the moments when human ambition overreaches and stone returns to sand. The contrast between Kemet and Deseret structured Egyptian geography and ideology from the earliest days of settlement, creating a worldview in which existence itself depended upon this boundary, this negotiation between fertile and barren, between life possible and life denied. You feel the silt between your toes, silky and mineral, already warm from the returning sun that has begun to color the eastern horizon in bands of rose and amber. The silt contains potash, phosphoric acid, and nitrogen, the three gifts of distant mountains delivered by water's patient labor, making this soil extraordinarily fertile without addition or amendment. No artificial fertilization was needed. The annual deposit sustained intensive agriculture for millennia, each flood laying down a fresh skin of nourishment upon the accumulated richness of centuries past. A surveyor with knotted rope walks the vanished field boundaries, re-establishing claims before planting can begin. You watch him move with deliberate pace, the rope extended between his hands, the knots that mark standard measures passing through his fingers like prayer beads. The rope is called by names that mean truth, that mean justice, that mean the agreement between what is claimed and what the gods have actually given. He stops where two markers have survived the flood's violence, stone pillars that lean now but still stand, and begins to pace the distance, to realign, to restore the geometry that taxation requires and memory demands. The floodplain varied from a few hundred meters to over 20 kilometers wide in Middle Egypt, and here, in this broad stretch, the re-establishment of boundaries will occupy teams of surveyors for weeks before the planting season arrives. The sound of geese, domestic and wild, reaches you from the north, their honking carried on still morning air that has not yet begun to move with the day's heat. A boy herds geese through the shallows, their beaks breaking the surface for food, for the tender shoots that emerge as water retreats, for the snails and small creatures that remain in the mud's upper layer. You are standing at the harbor at dawn, though this harbor is temporary, reconstituted each year from the flood's leavings, from the debris that settles in patterns the boy has learned to read. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes from boats that have ridden the flood's height, now stranded on mud that will harden to brick by season's end. The geese move as a mass, the boy's voice rising occasionally in a call that the birds recognize, that turns them, that gathers stragglers back into the flock's protection. The sweet, slightly fermented smell of papyrus stems cut and piled drifts across the water from the thickets where cutters work. You walk toward this smell, drawn by its complexity, by the way it speaks of plant matter in transition, of sugars beginning their slow conversion, of the marsh's particular chemistry. Papyrus cutters work the thickets, selecting stems for the temple's fresh supply of writing material, for the scrolls that will record this year's harvest, this year's taxes, this year's judgments. The papyrus, Cyperus papyrus, grew in the marshy delta, and along slow-moving waterways, its triangular stem rising to heights that a standing man could not reach without stretching. The cutters use knives of flint or copper, depending on their station, and work from small boats that drift among the stems, that part the green crowns with practiced hands. The visual of black against red, the sharp line where cultivation ends and desert begins, defines every prospect in this valley, every view from any elevation. You climb a low rise, the remains of last season's mud brick structure perhaps, and survey the pattern that repeats, that has repeated since before memory. The black silt contained potash, phosphoric acid, and nitrogen, making it extraordinarily fertile, and this fertility showed in the density of growth, in the deep green of emerging barley, in the stands of flax that would become linen, Egypt's principal textile, worn by all classes from the highest priest to the lowest field worker. The desert edges were used for cemeteries, stone quarries, and mining expeditions, the dead and the eternal placed deliberately in the red land, separated from the living by this geography of color and capacity. A woman gathers lotus heads for the evening meal, their mild narcotic properties known to all who have chewed the stems or steeped the petals in cooled water. You are standing at the edge of her path, watching her wade into a pool that remains where the flood has left a depression, where the lotus, Nymphea caerulea and Nymphea lotus, has established its floating kingdom. The blue and the white varieties open with the sun's rise and close with its setting, a discipline that gives them their association with the sun's journey, with rebirth, with the cycles that govern all visible life. She selects heads that have begun to close, that will keep their fragrance and their substance until the evening, and places them in a woven basket that floats beside her, that follows her movement through the water. The lotus was common in canals and ponds, in the managed waters that supplemented the flood's gift, in the garden pools of those whose station permitted such cultivation. The feel of silt between toes, silky and mineral, already warm from the returning sun, returns as you descend from your vantage, as you walk toward the line of sycamore fig trees that marks a village boundary. Sycamore fig trees, Ficus sycamorus, marked village boundaries and provided shade, their broad canopies creating rooms of coolness in the expanding heat of the day. You pass beneath their branches, noting the way the light fragments, the way the dappled pattern moves as a breath of wind, arrives from the south, from the direction of the sea that no one here has seen, but that influences all weather, all possibility. Beneath the sycamores, the earth has been swept clean by those who maintain the boundary's sanctity, who know that the tree's presence defines where one community ends and another begins, where one set of obligations yields to another. The Wadi Hammamat provided a route from the Nile to the Red Sea, used for trade and quarrying, and you imagine it now, though it lies far to the east, beyond the visible horizon, beyond the Red Land's first rise. Expeditions have departed from this very village in generations past, men leaving the Black Land for the uncertain passage through stone and dryness, emerging eventually at that other water, that other possibility of commerce and connection. The route carried not only goods, but also stone, the greywacke and the beacon stone that would be shaped into statues, into sarcophagi, into the eternal forms that the dead required. Acacia and tamarisk grew along the riverbanks, used for timber and boat building, and you can see their lean forms where the water's edge has stabilized, where the current's main force passes farther out in the channel. The acacia's thorns have gathered scraps of flood debris, a natural collection that will dry and bleach in the sun, that will eventually fall or be harvested for the small fires of cooking. The tamarisk's feathery foliage moves in the lightest air, a constant trembling that gives the tree its appearance of permanent anticipation, of readiness for whatever the river might bring. Boat builders will come to select trunks and branches, to assess the grain, to predict how the wood will behave when wetted and dried, when stressed by rope and by water's resistance. The transition from flood to planting was a time of intense communal labor, repairing canals and boundaries, and this labor surrounds you now in its early stages. Men and women work in groups that mix family and neighborhood, the old directing from positions of rest, the young carrying the heaviest loads of mud and cut reed. The shadoof, a counterweighted lever for lifting water, was in use by this period for irrigation, and you watch one in operation, the long pole pivoting on its support, the bucket of leather or pottery descending, filling, rising, pouring into a channel that will carry the water to fields still too elevated for the flood's direct touch. The operator works in a rhythm that seems to emerge from the body itself, from the weight and the counterweight, from the balance that requires no thought once learned, that continues as the mind drifts to other matters, to memory, to the songs that accompany such labor. Date palms provided fruit, shade, and fronds for basketry and roofing, and their regular spacing in the orchards speaks of planting, of human intention extended across generations. You walk among them now, the trunks rough against your palm where you steady yourself, the crown far above a green explosion against the lightening sky. The dates hang in clusters where they have survived the flood's highest reach, where the tree's height preserved them from the water's weight and duration. When ripe, they will be gathered, dried, stored, traded, consumed in the combinations that mark Egyptian cuisine, with emmer wheat, with barley, with the oils that press from various seeds. The fronds, when dried and split, become the material of baskets that will carry, that will store, that will strain the mud from water in the brick-making process. The crack of dried mud underfoot as the last pools evaporate accompanies your movement from the palm grove toward the brick-making area, where the season's building material is being prepared. Mud brick makers tread black earth with straw, forming the season's building material, their feet and bodies engaged in the work that their grandmothers and grandfathers performed, that extends back to the first settlement of this valley. You are standing at the edge of their operation, watching the mixture turn under their feet, the straw binding the clay, the water from the nearest pool providing the plasticity that permits shaping. The bricks will be formed in wooden molds, turned out to dry, stacked in patterns that permit air's circulation, that permit the sun's completion of what the flood began. Papyrus, Cyperus papyrus, grew in the marshy delta and along slow-moving waterways, and its presence indicated water sufficient for its needs, for the saturated soil that supported its root mass, its triangular stem, its feathery crown. The sound of geese, domestic and wild, their honking carried on still morning air, mingles with the voices of the cutters, with the splash of their poles, with the rhythm of their labor. You are standing at the harbor at dawn, though the harbor shifts with each season, with each flood's deposition and erosion, with the river's constant negotiation between mountain and sea. Land was measured in auroras, about 2,735 square meters, recorded by Scribes for tax purposes, and this measurement governed all that you see, all that will be planted in the weeks to come. The surveyor with knotted rope walks the vanished field boundaries, re-establishing claims before planting, and his work will be checked, recorded, disputed, affirmed in the documents that move between village and administrative center, between the field and the palace. The aurora was a standard derived from the practical measure of a team of oxen's daily capacity, from the real limits of what could be worked, what could be expected to yield, what could be justly claimed as due to the state, to the temple, to the landlord, to the cultivator himself. You walk toward this line now, away from the river's immediate presence, toward the zone where cultivation thins, where the effort of irrigation exceeds the return, where the desert's claim begins. A woman gathers lotus heads for the evening meal, and you pass her again, or another like her, the basket now fuller, the selected heads showing the particular shade of blue that will fade as they dry, that will be preserved only in the paintings of tombs, in the careful work of artists who mixed and applied their colors in the dark, by lamplight, for the eternal illumination of the dead. The lotus, Nymphea caerulea and Nymphea lotus, was common in canals and ponds, and its image appeared on capitals, on bowls, on the furniture of those who could afford such representation, who wished to surround themselves with the flower's associations, with its daily rebirth, with its fragrance and its mild transformation of consciousness. The sycamore fig trees, Ficus sycamorus, marked village boundaries and provided shade, and you rest now beneath one such boundary, your back against its trunk, your gaze moving across the scene of reconstitution, of the world being made again from the flood's residue. The date palms provided fruit, shade, and fronds for basketry and roofing, and their regular forms punctuate the middle distance, their green distinct against the black of wet earth, against the red of the desert's approach. The boy herds geese through the shallows, their beaks breaking the surface for food, and his voice reaches you in fragments, in the calls that direct, that gather, that maintain the flock's cohesion against the water's distraction, against the abundance that might scatter their attention. Flax was grown for linen, Egypt's principal textile, worn by all classes, and in the fields beyond the immediate village boundary, you can see the first emergence of this crop, the delicate blue-green of its early growth, the promise of the fibers that will be retted, dried, beaten, spun, woven into the fabric that defines Egyptian dress, that wraps the living and the dead in its cool, its lightness, its capacity to absorb and release moisture in the dry climate. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes, or have finished, or have never been, the harbor a fiction of your position, a way of placing yourself in the geography of exchange, of the movement that connects this village to others, this black land to the wider world of the river's passage. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes, or the cargoes have been unloaded, or the boats have departed with other goods, other hopes, other connections to maintain. Life in the fields, planting and harvest the black land stretches before you in the grey half-light of earliest morning, the flood having retreated to its proper channels some weeks past. You are standing at the edge of your allotted strip, the parcel measured by rope and marked by boundary stones, the soil still soft from the receding waters of the inundation. Around you, other figures emerge from the darkness, baskets balanced on shoulders, the seed within counted and precious, saved from the previous harvest against hunger and tax and the uncertainty of seasons. The air holds the chill of December, that month when planting must begin, when delay means famine, when the black soil waits like a promise kept across millennia. The sky lightens slowly, color seeping upward from the eastern horizon in bands of rose and pale gold. You feel the damp earth through the thin leather of your sandals, the moisture that will sustain what you are about to commit to its care. Emma wheat, Triticum dicoccum, fills your basket, the grains plump and selected, each one a future loaf, a future payment, a future continuation. The farmer beside you mutters a brief invocation, the words older than the boundary stones, older perhaps than the ordered fields themselves. You do not need to speak to share his concentration, his focus upon the task that will occupy the coming 4 months until March or April brings maturity. Your arm moves in the practiced arc of the sower, the seed scattering across the dark surface in a pattern learned from fathers and their fathers before. The grains fall like rain in reverse, descending to meet the soil that has descended to meet them, this exchange between human need and natural abundance. Emma wheat, Triticum dicoccum, you repeat to yourself, the Latin name strange in your mouth, the knowledge of it a later gift, the thing itself unchanged across the naming. The basket grows lighter with each gesture, the precious measure diminishing toward emptiness, toward the completion of this first sacred act. Behind the sowers come the oxen, their breath visible in the cold air, the ploughman guiding the light wooden frame through the soft black earth. You watch the blade scratch rather than turn, the Egyptian plough designed for this particular soil, this particular method of burial and covering. The oxen move slowly as the rising sun, as slowly as the river moves toward its eventual return. Their hooves press the scattered seed into contact with moisture, with the darkness that germination requires. The ploughman speaks to them constantly, a low murmur of encouragement and direction, the language between human and animal older than any written word. Children follow the ploughs and the sowers, their slings whirling against the sky, their cries rising sharp against the morning. You remember being such a child, the responsibility of grain protection falling even to small hands, the birds descending in clouds where seed lay exposed. The children move with energy you no longer possess, their voices carrying across the geometric patterns of green that will emerge, that you can almost see in imagination, the shoots of emmer wheat and barley, hordeum vulgare, rising in their ordered rows. The black land accepts their noise as it accepts everything, the cycle of protection and growth and consumption continuing without comment. The sun climbs higher, burning away the last of the morning chill, and you straighten your back to observe the progress across the field. The geometric patterns of planting emerge even in the ungerminated soil, the strips and parcels of different farmers creating a visual texture of ownership and obligation. Narrow canals, filled from the receding flood, thread between the planted areas, the irrigation that substitutes for the rain this land does not receive. You walk to one such channel, kneeling to feel the water, to confirm its presence, its sufficiency for the months ahead. The liquid carries the cold of its source, the memory of the flood that made this agriculture possible, this civilization possible. By midday, the sowing of your strip is complete, the seed covered by the passage of plough and the pressing of hooves. You learn that pigs have been driven across some parcels, their trampling working seed into ground the plough could not properly reach, their disturbance another method among many. The farmer whose strip adjoins yours gestures toward the palm grove that marks the field's edge, and you follow, legs heavy with hours of bending and casting. The shade falls across you like water, cool and sudden, the fronds overhead filtering the sun into patterns of light and dark upon the earth. A woman approaches from the grove's deeper shade, carrying a large jar upon her shoulder, the liquid within audibly shifting with her steps. You smell the barley beer before she reaches you, hordeum vulgare, transformed by fermentation into this sour-sweet sustenance, the drink of field workers across the black land. She sets the jar down with a grunt of effort, and you gather with the others, passing the vessel from hand to hand, the common mouth upon the rim binding you in temporary equality. The beer tastes of grain and thyme, slightly sour, slightly sweet, the freshness of morning brewing giving way to warmth and mild intoxication. You drink deeply, the liquid cutting through the dust that has accumulated in your throat, the dryness of constant exertion. The palm grove shelters lizards upon its trunks, their bodies pressed flat against the bark, seeking the coolness you have found. Even they have slowed in this heat, this midday intensity that will persist until the shadows lengthen toward evening. You lie upon your back, watching the fronds move in the consistent north wind, the same wind that will later serve the winnowing, that carries both benefit and burden across this landscape. The woman who brought the beer sits apart, her own portion measured, her eyes closed in the temporary peace of the break. You do not speak, the silence of exhaustion and satisfaction sufficient between those who share this labor, this dependence upon the black land and its patterns. The afternoon returns you to the field, though the work changes with the passing hours. You walk the planted strips with others, pressing by foot where the plough has been too shallow, where seed remains visible and vulnerable. The soil feels different now, warmed by the sun, the moisture retreating toward depths the roots must follow. You think of the growing season that will last about 4 months, the slow transformation of buried grain into erect stems, into the green shoots in geometric patterns across the black land that you have seen in other years, that you will see again if the river continues its faithfulness. Emma wheat, Triticum dicoccum, preferred for bread, the staff of life in its most direct form. Barley, hordeum vulgare, for beer and for animal fodder, the secondary crop that enables the primary. The day ends with the sun descending toward the western desert, the red land consuming the light as it has consumed so much else. You walk toward the village, your body aching in specific places, the repetition of gesture having worn particular paths of discomfort. Others pass you, returning from other strips, other parcels, the collective movement of a population bound to this schedule, this necessity. The smell of cooking fires reaches you first, then the sound of voices released from the concentration of labor, the evening's temporary freedom. You do not look back at the field, knowing it continues in darkness, the germination you cannot see or hurry proceeding without witness. The months pass in their measured sequence, the green shoots emerging as you knew they would, the geometric patterns of cultivation becoming visible across the black land. You walk the narrow canals, clearing obstructions, ensuring the water reaches where it must, the irrigation that substitutes for rain, for the mercy of distant weather. The plants rise through their stages, the jointing and heading and filling, the terminology of growth that translates to waiting, to patience, to the observation of signs. Emma wheat, Triticum dicoccum, and barley, Hordeum vulgare, stand in their separate parcels, the visual distinction clear to your experienced eye, the one taller, the one earlier, the one destined for different purposes. The heat intensifies as the calendar moves toward March or April, the months when crops mature, when the green turns to gold, when the harvest must begin. You feel the change in your body, the sweat that evaporates too slowly, the lassitude that creeps upon you even in morning coolness. The lizards have abandoned the open ground entirely, seeking the shade of walls, of palm groves, of any interruption in the flatness. You understand their wisdom, their surrender to conditions that human need cannot acknowledge. The work continues because it must, because the window of harvest is finite, because grain left too long will shatter, will fall, will return to the earth without passing through human hands. The reaper's sickle makes a rhythmic sound across the field, the curved blade slicing through stems that have grown tall and heavy with grain. You are among the bent backs moving across the field, the motion repetitive, the back protesting, the hands developing their own calluses upon older calluses. The sound joins with others, becomes a texture rather than individual strokes, the harvest proceeding in its collective method, its ancient choreography. You gather the cut stems into sheaves, binding them with twisted straw, the bundles that will travel to threshing, to transformation. The sun presses upon your neck, upon your shoulders, the heat of midday harvest when even the lizards seek shade and work slows to survival. A woman brings beer in a large jar, the same woman perhaps, a different woman, the role continuous across seasons and years. You move to the shade of the palm grove, the fronds now offering less protection than in the thinner light of December, but still precious, still necessary. The beer is passed, the common jar moving from mouth to mouth, the taste of fresh barley beer, slightly sour, slightly sweet, cutting through the dust of the field. You drink and pass, the rhythm of refreshment matching the rhythm of labor, the two inseparable in memory and anticipation. The woman watches without drinking, her supply measured, her own thirst secondary to the service she provides. The sheaves accumulate, are loaded upon donkeys or gathered for transport by boat, the method depending upon distance, upon water access, upon the particular arrangements of this estate. You are a tenant farmer, working land that belongs to temple or crown or wealthy official, the portion remaining after tax and rent and seed reserved for the next season determining your family's survival. The state takes its portion as tax, measured and recorded by scribes who appear with their pallets and their precise questions, their calculations that translate grain into obligation, into the surplus that builds monuments, maintains armies, sustains the structure that contains your life. You watch them measure, the honesty or its absence a power you do not possess, the record permanent in a way your labor is not. The threshing floor awaits, a hard circle of compacted earth, the surface prepared for the transformation that separates grain from straw, from chaff, from the inedible structures of the plant. You unload your sheaves, spread them across the surface, the visual of gold upon gold, of harvest upon harvest, satisfying in its abundance, its promise of sustenance. The oxen are brought, or donkeys, their hooves suited to the treading that loosens grain from husk, that begins the long process of purification. You guide them in their circles, the animals patient, the dust rising with each step, coating every surface, every eyelash, every breath. The smell of crushed grain and chaff, dry and golden, fills your nose and throat, the particular dust of this moment, this transformation. The threshing continues for days, the floor never empty, the animals rotating, the workers rotating, the sun passing overhead in its indifferent arc. You sleep near the floor, wake to resume, the rhythm erasing the distinction between days, between efforts, between the exhaustion that accumulates and the necessity that overrides it. The dust settles upon your skin, becomes a second surface, a visible record of your participation. You taste it in the barley beer, feel it in the grit between your teeth, the universal presence of this particular season, this particular labor. The animal's hooves press and loosen, the grain gradually freeing itself from its enclosures. Winnowing follows threshing, the wooden shovels rising and falling in rhythmic motion, the grain tossed into the consistent north wind. You stand on the edge of the floor, the shovel heavy in your hands, the motion learned through repetition, through the correction of those who watched your first attempts. The wind takes the chaff, carries it aside, deposits it in drifts that will serve other purposes, other transformations. The heavier grain falls back, purified, separated, ready for the next stage of its journey. The sound of wooden winnowing shovels, rhythmic, with the constant background of wind, becomes the sound of this week, this period, the auditory signature of completion approaching. You watch the grain accumulate in its pure form, the golden heap growing with each shovel's work, the measure of your season's effort made visible, made countable. The scribes return, their palettes ready, their questions precise, the portion for tax determined, recorded, removed. You do not watch the loaded vessels depart, turning instead to the remainder, the portion that must sustain until the next harvest, that must provide seed for the next planting in November or December, as soon as the flood recedes sufficiently. The mathematics of survival occupy your evening, the calculations of mouths and days, and the generosity or severity of the coming flood. The grain is stored in communal or temple granaries, raised on pedestals against rodents and damp, the elevation visible against the flatness of the surrounding landscape. You carry your portion, or have it carried, the donkeys patient, the boats slow upon the water. The granary walls are thick, the ventilation calculated, the protection against the enemies of stored grain as important as the harvest itself. You smell the accumulated harvest within, the concentration of what the black land has yielded, the promise of bread and beer across the months until the cycle renews. Your own stores are smaller, domestic, the jar against the wall, the hidden cache against uncertainty. You place them with care, with the knowledge of what hunger means, what the failure of the flood means, what the accumulation of bad years means. The black land is generous, but not certain, the pattern reliable until it is not, the trust in recurrence a faith that experience sometimes contradicts. You sleep near your stores, wake to check them, the psychology of scarcity persisting even in relative abundance, the memory of hunger older than any particular hunger you have known. The fields, stripped of grain, reveal their other productions, the vegetables that grow in the remaining moisture, in the spaces between cereal cultivation. Onions rise in their rows, garlic with its sharp scent, lettuce unfolding in the coolness of remaining shade. Cucumbers and melons spread across the earth, their vines seeking space, their fruits swelling with the water that sustained the grain now harvested. Pulses, lentils, chickpeas, beans, fix their nitrogen, restore what the cereals have taken, the rotation of ancient wisdom. You tend these lesser crops with attention that cereal production has exhausted, the smaller harvests no less important for their variety, their contribution to health and flavor, and the avoidance of monotony. The fruit trees offer their sequence of ripening, the dates clustering upon the palms, the figs swelling and splitting with their particular sweetness. Grapes hang in their bunches, destined for eating, for drying, for the wine that accompanies festival and offering. Pomegranates redden, their complex interior a reward for the patience of peeling, the careful extraction of arils. Dom palm nuts fall to be gathered, their hard shells protecting the edible kernel, their collection a different posture, a different motion from the bending of cereal harvest. You move among these trees, these vines, these different architectures of growth, the variety a relief from the concentration upon grain. The consistent north wind continues, the wind that winnowed the grain now cooling the air after harvest, now carrying the smell of distant places, of the desert that borders the black land. You stand at the field's edge, where cultivation ends and the red land begins, the sharp line that defines possibility, that has defined this civilization's concentrated existence. The visual of black against red, the frame of your world, holds your attention as the sun descends, as the day releases you from its requirements. You feel the air move across your face, cool now, carrying the dust of threshing, the memory of chaff upon chaff, the golden dryness that filled every breath. The evening meal includes bread from last year's Emma wheat, triticum dicocum, the preference for bread making confirmed in each bite, each texture. The beer is from barley, hordeum vulgare, the sour-sweet taste that accompanies rest after labor, that marks the transition from effort to recovery. You eat with your family, the portion measured, the presence of each member noted, accounted for, valued. The children who drove birds from the sown fields now sit subdued, the energy of their morning roll converted to the stillness of evening, the accumulation of their own exhaustion. You do not speak of the next season, the next planting in November or December, the next flood and retreat and preparation. The cycle is known, assumed, the present moment sufficient for attention, for the peace of completion. The stars emerge in their patterns, the same patterns that guided the timing of planting, that oriented the first sower in the darkness of earliest morning. You lie upon the roof of your dwelling, the heat of the day rising from the structure beneath you, the air above cooling toward the temperature of comfort. The sound of the village continues around you, the conversations of others released from labor, the animals settling, the occasional cry of a child resisting sleep. You feel your own body descending, the weight of harvest, of threshing, of winnowing, pressing you toward the darkness that is not the flood's retreat, but its own renewal, its own preparation. You breathe it still, lying in darkness, the afterimage of golden heaps, of wooden shovels rising against the sky, of the consistent north wind carrying chaff toward the red land. The geometric patterns of cultivation, the green shoots that became gold, the black land yielding its measured abundance, play behind your closed eyes, the visual memory replacing the actual dark. You are standing at the harbor at dawn, or you are standing at the field's edge, or you are lying here, the positions merging, the time dissolving, the cycle continuing in your body, even as your body releases its hold upon conscious participation. The particular mix that defines this place, this season, this moment in the long sequence of flood and retreat and preparation and planting and growth and harvest and flood again, settles around you like the dust upon the threshing floor, like the chaff upon the wind. The taste of fresh barley beer, slightly sour, slightly sweet, remains upon your tongue, the common jar passed from hand to hand, the communal mouth upon the rim, the binding of shared labor and shared refreshment. The heat of midday harvest, when even the lizards seek shade and work slows to survival, has passed into the coolness that permits full rest, that allows the body to repair what the season has demanded. You feel this repair beginning, the gradual descent, the letting go of the vigilance that waking in the fields requires. The black land stretches in all directions, the red land beyond, the sharp line between them holding even in darkness, even in the absence of visual confirmation, the knowledge of it permanent, inherited, assumed. You are standing at the field's edge, or you are lying here, or you are moving in the slow circles of the threshing floor, the oxen patient, the dust rising, the grain gradually freeing itself from its enclosures, from the chaff that the wind will carry away, that the consistent north wind will separate and deposit and transform into the drifts of another season, another purpose, another form of the abundance that the black land offers and requires and continues in its ancient pattern, its ancient faithfulness, its ancient demand for human participation, for human attention, for the measured commitment of seed to soil, of effort to season, of life to the cycle that contains and renews it, the cycle that you have joined, that you have always been part of, that will continue when your particular participation has completed its arc, its sowing and growing and harvest, its contribution to the accumulation that outlives any single season, any single hand casting seed upon the dark surface, any single back bent in the heat of midday, any single mouth upon the common jar, any single sleep descending into the darkness that precedes the dawn, that precedes the rising, that precedes the return to the field, to the strip, to the measured parcel, to the black land waiting, always waiting for the next gesture, the next commitment, the next beginning in the long sequence that has no true beginning, no true end, only continuation, only the pattern, only the cycle of flood and retreat and preparation and planting and growth and harvest and flood again. The morning arrives at Karnak with a softness that seems to hesitate before entering the great courtyard, as though the light itself must first be read and approved by the gatekeepers of the temple. You are standing now at the threshold of the House of Life, the Per-Ankh, where the stone walls have absorbed centuries of whispered syllables, and the floor has been worn smooth by the passage of sandaled feet carrying the weight of knowledge. The cold air moves across your face, carrying from the river a dampness that will linger until the sun has climbed above the pylons. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes of papyrus reeds from the boats moored at the quay, the bundles bound with palm fiber and stacked like sleeping children against the eastern wall. A boy of 8 sits cross-legged in the House of Life at Karnak, copying the same phrase until his fingers cramp. His name is Amenemope, though he will not be called by it here. He is simply the student or the hand, for individual distinction arrives only with mastery. Before him lies a wooden pallet, its 2 hollows holding the black and red ink cakes that have been softened overnight in water. The reed brush in his fingers is still unfamiliar, still inclined to splutter or to drag, and the papyrus before him bears the ghosts of his errors, the faint traces of washes where his instructor has made him begin again. The phrase he copies is from the instructions of Kejmni, that text of ancient counsel which every scribble student at Karnak must learn before proceeding to greater complexity. The scribe, he writes, and pauses, and writes again. The scribe, he directs every work in this land. His thumb smudges the wet ink, and he reaches for a scrap of linen to blot the damage, his heart beating with the small terror of imperfection. The senior scribe, Hapuseneb, moves between the rows of students with a quietness that belies his 60 years, his linen robe whispering against the stone. He carries his own palette, the wood darkened by decades of handling, and in his fingers, a reed brush with a tip worn to the precise angle of his preference. The morning instruction at the House of Life at Karnak proceeds according to patterns established long before any living memory, the students advancing from simple copying to more demanding exercises only when their hands have proven sufficiently obedient. Hapuseneb pauses behind a Amenemope, observes the unevenness of the hieratic signs, the cursive script used for administrative and literary texts on papyrus and ostraka. The boy has pressed too hard. The brush has frayed at the edges of each stroke, leaving a tremor that speaks of haste or of fatigue. Again, Hapuseneb says, and moves on, his shadow passing over the papyrus like a cloud crossing the sun. The afternoon light through clerestory windows falls on rows of hunched students, each absorbed in the private struggle between intention and execution. You are seated now upon a woven mat, your back against the coolness of the stone floor beneath, which warms only slowly through the day as the heat accumulates in the plastered walls. The smell of wet ink rises around you, slightly acrid, mingling with the dry dust of crushed ochre for red pigment that drifts from the grinding room adjacent. A student 2 rows ahead has begun to doze, his chin sinking toward his chest, and Hapuseneb's assistant moves to wake him with a tap of the pallet's edge against the boy's shoulder. The sound of reed brush on papyrus continues, a subtle scratching in an otherwise silent room, broken only by the occasional cough or the shifting of a cramped limb. The standard scribble education took several years, beginning with copying standard texts, such as the instructions of Cagemi and Tahotep, those compendia of counsel that instructed the student in proper conduct toward superiors and inferiors alike. Menemope has completed 2 years of this training, 2 years of rising before dawn to wash in the temple pool, to break his fast with a handful of dates eaten quickly, the only permitted break during morning instruction, and to assume his position before the assigned text. His father was a scribe, and his father before him, for scribes were trained from childhood, typically from scribble families, though some rose from other classes through exceptional talent or through the favor of a patron. The boy knows that his own path has been eased by this lineage, that his fingers were expected before his birth to hold the reed brush, his eyes to discern the subtle distinctions between signs that resemble one another in their hieratic forms. In the chamber beyond the students, a senior scribe checks land survey records, his red ink correcting the black of his subordinate. The documents concern the fields east of Thebes, the measured parcels that must be reassessed after the inundation has altered their boundaries, the black land waiting, always waiting, for the next gesture of human measurement. You are standing at the doorway now, observing the precision with which the senior scribe applies his corrections, the red strokes precise as surgical incisions, each indicating a discrepancy in the calculation of area or in the transcription of the field's name. The subordinate stands at respectful distance, his own palette held against his chest, watching his errors being marked with the color that signifies both importance and warning. The records must be exact, for they determine the tax assessments that will sustain the temple and the royal house, the cycle of flood and retreat and preparation and planting and growth and harvest and flood again. The mathematics of the scribe included practical geometry for land measurement and pyramid construction, though the great age of pyramid building had passed long before the present morning at Karnak. Still, the principles remained, preserved in the house of life at Karnak, as in other such institutions, attached to major temples throughout the Black Land. A student of 14 recites allowed the method for calculating the area of a triangle, his voice the monotone of rote memorization, while his companions continue their silent copying. The formula he speaks was old when the pyramids at Giza were raised, and it will persist when the present dynasty has become entry and number in the Turin king list and other king lists compiled in houses of life, those documents that preserve the sequence of rulers across the millennia. A medical papyrus is unrolled for consultation, its cases of head wounds and their treatments displayed across the cedar table of the chief physician. You are standing at the edge of this consultation, close enough to observe the careful manner in which the scroll is handled, the supports placed at intervals to prevent strain upon the brittle fibers. This is a copy of the Edwin Smith papyrus, dated to approximately 1600 BCE, though the original composition may be older still, and it describes with systematic clarity the examination, diagnosis, and treatment of traumatic injuries. The physician's finger traces the hieratic text, pausing at the case of a skull fracture where the text prescribes observation and the application of a poultice rather than intervention. The afternoon advances, and the heat that has accumulated in the plastered walls now releases into the chamber, the coolness of the stone floor beneath the scribe's mat gradually surrendering to the warmth of the season. Amenemope's fingers have cramped and released, across the hours of copying, and now, at last, Hapuseneb permits the students to set aside their exercises. The boy rises with difficulty, his legs numb from the crossed position, and joins the movement toward the courtyard where water and a brief rest await. The sound of reed brush on papyrus diminishes, then ceases, the silence that follows seeming almost loud in its unfamiliarity. Around him, the other students stretch their limbs, exchange the few permitted words, their voices low as though the habit of quiet has entered their very speech. You are walking now through the corridors of the House of Life at Karnak, observing the various activities that constitute its function. In one chamber, a scribe dictates from a king list, his assistant recording the sequence of rulers and their reign lengths, a scene suggesting the kind of compilation that may have contributed to documents like the Turin king list and other king lists associated with houses of life. The sources before him are older documents, some damaged, some contradictory, and his task is to reconcile them into a coherent narrative of succession. The work requires judgment as well as transcription, the ability to weigh the reliability of one source against another, to recognize interpolation or error. In another chamber, the manufacture of papyrus proceeds. The strips of the reed stem laid at right angles upon a hard surface, pressed together until their natural sap forms an adhesive bond, then dried to the finished sheet. You are standing at the edge of this workshop, watching the practiced movements of the craftsmen, their hands stained green from the fresh reeds. The quality varies. The finest sheets, smooth and pale, reserved for religious or royal documents. The coarser, darker material provided for drafts, student exercises, the ephemeral communications of daily administration. Papyrus was manufactured by layering strips at right angles, pressing and drying, a technique that had changed little across the centuries, that produced the surface upon which the civilization recorded itself. A messenger arrives with a sealed letter from the vizier. The scribe breaks the clay, reads, dictates reply. You're present in the reception chamber as this occurs, observing the formalities that surround even the most urgent communication. The messenger kneels, presents the sealed document upon a small tray of polished wood, and withdraws to a respectful distance, while the senior scribe examines the clay seal for signs of tampering. The seal bears the vizier's mark, intact, and the scribe breaks it with a small tool kept for this purpose, the fragments collected in a dish for later verification. The letter within is written in hieratic, and the scribe reads it with a speed that comes from long practice, his lips moving slightly with the words. The contents concern the arrival of a Nubian delegation at Thebes, their request for an audience with the god's wife, the necessary preparations of protocol and accommodation. The scribe dictates his reply to an assistant, who records it in draft upon a wooden tablet coated with wax, the stylus leaving its temporary marks to be reviewed and approved before transcription to papyrus. Ostraka, limestone flakes or pottery sherds used for drafts, student exercises and notes fill baskets in the corners of chambers, their surfaces bearing the casual inscriptions of daily necessity, lists of supplies, reminders of appointments, the occasional drawing or fragment of verse. A student has abandoned his failed exercise upon one such sherd, the signs malformed beyond redemption, and it will join the others in the basket, evidence of the labor that precedes competence. Literacy rates in ancient Egypt were likely low, perhaps around 1% of the population, concentrated among scribes and officials, and even within this privileged minority, the degrees of skill varied considerably, from the functional minimum of the workman who could write his name, and a few standard phrases to the mastery of the senior scribe who might work with hieroglyphs, a script used for monumental inscriptions and religious contexts, with considerable expertise. The distinction between hieratic and hieroglyphs permeates every aspect of scribble practice. Hieratic, a cursive script, was used for administrative and literary texts on papyrus and ostraka, its forms simplified and connected for speed of execution. Hieroglyphs were reserved for monumental inscriptions and religious contexts, their elaborate pictorial forms requiring precise execution and carrying the weight of sacred significance. Amenemope has begun to study the hieroglyphic signs, their relationships to the cursive forms he has already learned, but his instruction in this more demanding script will extend for years yet. The boy of 8 sits cross-legged in the house of life at Karnak, copying the same phrase until his fingers cramp. And in this repetition lies the foundation of all that may follow, the patience that outlasts the body's protest. The taste of dates eaten quickly lingers in your own mouth now, the sweetness cut with the slight astringency of their skin, as you observe the afternoon's progression toward evening. The light through the clerestory windows has shifted, the angled beams moving across the floor to illuminate now the western wall, now the doorway, now the basin where hands are washed before handling sacred texts. The smell of wet ink, slightly acrid, persists, but the dry dust of crushed ochre for red pigment has settled, the grinding room silent now until tomorrow's preparation. A senior scribe moves through the chambers, collecting the day's exercises for review, his presence prompting the final attentions of students who had begun to anticipate release. But first there is the evening, the proper conclusion of the day's labor. The scribe washes his palate, the black and red cakes softened for tomorrow's work, the water in the basin taking the color of his day's usage, first dark, then ruddy, then clear as the wood releases its accumulation. The palate itself, the wood darkened by decades of handling in the case of Hapuseneb, newer and paler in the case of Amenemope, receives careful attention, the hollows scraped clean, the surface wiped with a cloth. The reed brushes are examined, the worn discarded, the sound of reed brush on papyrus now only memory, a subtle scratching in an otherwise silent room that will resume with the morning. The senior scribe Hapuseneb performs these ablutions with the deliberation of ritual, though no priest oversees them, no hymn accompanies them. The house of life at Karnak is itself sacred, the per-ankh attached to the temple of Ammon, and the work conducted within it partakes of that sanctity. The knowledge he maintains, the skills he transmits, the texts he copies and corrects and compiles, all depend upon this daily renewal, this willingness to begin again what has been begun countless times before. Amenemope observes his instructor's method, attempting to emulate the economy of movement, the completeness of attention. The boy's own palate requires less care, its surface is less worn, its ink cakes smaller, consumed by the errors of learning. He washes it nonetheless, the water cool against his fingers, the pigment swirling away into the basin. The coolness of the stone floor beneath his mat has long since warmed, but now, as the evening advances and the heat of the day begins to dissipate, a new coolness descends from the clerestory windows, the sky beyond them darkening toward the deep blue that precedes full night. The taste of dates eaten quickly has passed, replaced by the flatness of thirst, the water he drinks from the courtyard jar seeming sweeter for the day's labor. The other students depart, their voices rising briefly in the corridor before the discipline of the institution suppresses them. Amenemope remains, granted permission to complete a copying that had fallen behind the required progress. The afternoon light through clerestory windows has faded to the point where oil lamps are necessary, their flames steady in the still air, casting shadows that move with the scribe's hand across the papyrus. The sound of reed brush on papyrus resumes, a subtle scratching in an otherwise silent room, the boy's concentration narrowed to the immediate sign, the next stroke, the maintenance of alignment and proportion. The instructions of Ptahhotep, that other standard didactic text for scribble students, lies before him now, its counsels concerning the proper conduct of those who would advance in the service of the state. The senior scribe, Hapuseneb, returns to check upon this solitary student, his presence unannounced, his observation unacknowledged. The boy's hand has steadied across the hours, the tremor of fatigue giving way to a mechanical precision that approaches the automatic. Text flows, the hieratic signs connecting one to another in the cursive sequence that saves time and space. Hapuseneb makes no sound, but Amenemope senses his presence nonetheless, some disturbance in the air, some quality of attention that differs from emptiness. The boy continues, not daring to acknowledge what he perceives, until at last the senior scribe moves away, his linen robe whispering against the stone, his shadow passing over the papyrus like a cloud crossing the sun. The evening deepens, and the house of life at Karnak empties of all but the most necessary attendants. You are walking now through the corridors, your sandals silent upon the worn smoothness of the floor, the walls releasing the accumulated warmth of the day into the cooling air. The smell of wet ink, slightly acrid, has diminished to a trace, a ghost of the day's industry, and the dry dust of crushed ochre for red pigment sleeps in its containers, waiting for the morrow's grinding. In the chamber where the medical papyrus was consulted, the scroll has been returned to its case, the cedar table wiped clean, the supports stored against future need. The Edwin Smith papyrus, dated to approximately 1600 BCE, rests in darkness, its cases of head wounds and their treatments inaccessible, until the next requirement summons them into light. The mathematics of land measurement, the practical geometry for pyramid construction, the formulae for area and volume, all sleep too in their papyrus repositories, in the ostraka baskets, in the memories of those who have copied and recopied them across the years. The Turin king list and other king lists compiled in houses of life maintain their sequence of rulers, their reign lengths and their summaries, the narrative of royal succession that constitutes the temporal framework of the state. The stars emerge in their familiar patterns, the constellations that regulate the calendar, that determine the timing of the inundation, that guide the rituals of the temple. The cold air moves across your face, carrying now a dryness that speaks of the desert beyond the river, the red land that waits beyond the black. The merchants have long since departed, their cargoes of papyrus reeds unloaded and stored, the boats moored at the quay rocking gently with the current. The cycle of flood and retreat and preparation and planting and growth and harvest and flood again continues in its vast rhythm. And within that cycle, the house of life at Karnak maintains its more rapid pulse, the daily renewal of copying and correction and compilation and dictation, and the washing of palettes that prepares for the next day's beginning. Amenemhotep completes his exercise by lamplight, the final signs of the instructions of Ptahhotep falling into their proper places with a precision that surprises even his tired hand. He washes his palette, the black and red cakes softened for tomorrow's work, the water taking the last of the day's pigment. The reed brush he sets aside, its tip worn but serviceable to be trimmed or replaced in the morning. The papyrus he rolls carefully, the edges aligned, the surface protected from the air that would dry and crack it. The senior scribe Hapuseneb has retired to his quarters, his day's corrections complete, his review of the land survey records concluded, his reply to the sealed letter from the vizier dispatched with the returning messenger. The title scribe follows him, as it follows many who hold administrative positions, for scribes held significant social prestige, and the title was used even by those who did not write, by officials whose authority derived from their association with the literate class. This prestige, this social elevation of the Per-Ankh and its products, permeates the institution, distinguishing its members even in retirement, in death, in the memory preserved by their descendants and their successors. The night advances, and the house of life at Karnak settles into the stillness that precedes the dawn, that precedes the rising, that precedes the return to the mat, to the palette, to the reed brush, to the papyrus waiting, always waiting for the next gesture, the next commitment, the next beginning in the long sequence that has no true beginning, no true end, only continuation, only the pattern, only the cycle of copying and correction and compilation, and the washing of palettes, and the softening of ink, and the sound of reed brush on papyrus, a subtle scratching in an otherwise silent room, and the afternoon light through clerestory windows, and the taste of dates eaten quickly, and the coolness of the stone floor beneath the scribe's mat, warming only slowly through the day, and the smell of wet ink, slightly acrid, and the dry dust of crushed ochre for red pigment, all of it waiting, all of it preparing, all of it continuing in the darkness that precedes the dawn at the House of Life, the Per Ankh at Karnak, in the Black Land, in the measured parcel of time that the scribes preserve, that the scribes measure, that the scribes, in their writing, in their waiting, in their patient repetition, make and unmake and make again. The village of Deir el-Medina, the village of the tomb painters, sits in a narrow wadi between the high cliffs of the western bank and the steeper ridge that separates it from the Valley of the Kings. You are standing at the edge of this settlement in the darkness before dawn, and the air moves across your face with a coolness that will not survive the morning. Around you, the small houses press close together along a single central path, their upper stories dark against the slightly lighter sky. The village existed from approximately 1550 to 1080 BCE, primarily during the New Kingdom, and it housed approximately 40 to 60 families, perhaps 200 to 300 people at any time. You feel the packed earth beneath your sandals, smoothed by generations of feet walking this same route before first light. Carr, a tomb painter of the right side team, emerges from his doorway carrying a small jar of lamp oil in his left hand. His right shoulder brushes the jamb of the well-constructed house with its 3 to 4 rooms, its upper story where his family sleeps, its cellar where last year's grain still waits in sealed jars. The house receives payments in grain, fish, vegetables, water, pottery, and wood from the state, and Carr has eaten bread and onion in the darkness while his wife prepared the morning meal without speaking, the silence of routine long established. You watch him pause at the threshold and look back once at the small temple of Hathor where yesterday he left an offering of beer. The temple stands among numerous stelae dedicated to deified kings and local gods, and the stone catches no light yet, holds no color, waits only for the sun that will paint it briefly before the heat of midday drives worshippers to shade. The path rises from the village, and Carr walks with the others of his team, the right side, each with a foreman who walks at the rear counting heads in the darkness. The workers were organized into 2 teams, the right side and the left side, each with a foreman, and this division governs every aspect of their labor in the valley across the ridge. You feel the incline in your own legs as the path steepens, the loose scree shifting underfoot, the larger stones placed deliberately by earlier generations to ease this climb that begins each working day. The smell of hot rock in the valley intensifies even now, before the sun has touched it, as if the stone retains yesterday's heat and offers it slowly to the cooling air of night. At the ridge's crest, the Valley of the Kings opens below, and Carr stops with the others to let a donkey train pass, the animals carrying fresh water in skins for the quarrying team whose work has already begun. The sound of chisels and stone hammers, distant, rhythmic, reaches you across the still air, a percussion without melody that will continue until the heat of midday forces pause. You watch the first visible light touch the highest cliffs across the valley, a line of pale gold that seems to hover before settling, as if the sun hesitates to enter this place of perpetual preparation for death. This dawn ritual of crossing the ridge has been repeated through centuries of such mornings, through generations of workers who walk this path 8 days out of 10, with 2 days off, in the valley across the ridge. The tomb entrance gapes, its mouth shored with timber, and Carr lights his lamp from the guard's fire, the flame small and yellow in the jar's shallow oil. You follow him into the descending corridor and the coolness of the tomb's deepest chamber, where the sarcophagus will rest, year-round, rises to meet you from below, a breath of stone that has never known the sun's direct touch. The corridor turns again, following the ancient pattern that conceals the burial chamber behind false passages and descending stairs. Carr's lamp throws shadows that move with his stride, and the painted gods emerging from darkness, their colors still vivid after millennia, begin to appear on walls that yesterday were bare limestone, their outlines sketched in red by the master designer, their forms waiting for the painter's completion. In the unfinished tomb, Ka mixes his colors: orpiment yellow, Egyptian blue, red ochre, carbon black. You stand beside him in the chamber assigned to the right side team, and the astronomical ceiling stretches above, the goddess Nut arched across the sky, her body dotted with stars that Ka will paint with Egyptian blue, the color of the heavens, the color that imitates lapis from far lands. The right side team works on the ceiling, the left side on the sarcophagus chamber, and the division of labor means that Ka will not see his counterparts until the midday meal, will work in the lamp's small circle with his own team, their breathing, their movements, their occasional words the only signs of other presence in this underground world. The taste of dust in the throat, limestone and pigment, inhaled for hours, begins already, a dryness that no water fully relieves, that accumulates through the working day until evening brings the walk back to the village, where washing is the first act of return. A boy apprentice grinds malachite for green, the stone reduced to powder on a flat pallet, and the sound of his grinder, rhythmic, slower than the distant quarrying, fills the chamber's silence between the painter's movements. You watch the boy's hands, still soft, still learning the pressure that reduces stone to usable color, the patience that this work demands, the attention that separates the skilled from the merely competent. Many workers had secondary skills: carpentry, sculpture, painting, or priestly functions, and this boy may yet become a sculptor of sarcophagi, a carpenter of coffins, a priest who tends the small temples of Deir el-Medina, where numerous stelae dedicated to deified kings and local gods receive the offerings of a community that governs its own affairs. The village was self-governing, with its own court, police, and internal administration, and this autonomy shapes the boy's education as much as his master's instruction, teaches him that the tomb painters are not merely workers, but citizens of a place with its own laws, its own disputes, its own recorded decisions. The morning passes in the application of color to prepared plaster, the orpiment yellow bright even in lamplight, the red ochre deep and warm, the carbon black defining edges that without it would blur into confusion. You feel the ache beginning in your own back, the strain in your own eyes, as Ka works with his brush extended to reach the ceiling's center, his body twisted, his neck craned, the position that will produce by evening the familiar pain of return. The painted gods receive their first layers of true color today, the red outlines gradually obscured by the filled forms, the flat Egyptian style that presents the gods in their eternal postures, their eternal significance, their eternal presence in the tomb that will house the king's eternal body. The sound of chisels and stone hammers, distant, rhythmic, continues without variation, and you recognize in this percussion the marking of time that the tomb itself resists, the measurement of hours that the astronomical ceiling will deny in its representation of eternal cycles. This small population must produce all the labor for the royal tombs, all the administration, all the self-governance that the village isolation demands. Workers received payments in grain, fish, vegetables, water, pottery, and wood from the state, and the reliability of these payments, the regularity of this support, underlies the social contract that keeps Ka working in this darkness, that keeps the boy grinding malachite, that keeps the right side and the left side in their appointed places. Lunch is eaten in the valley's heat, bread and dried fish carried from the village, and Ka emerges from the tomb's mouth into light that seems violent after the lamp's small circle. You feel the sun's weight on your shoulders, the immediate thirst that the dry air produces, the contrast between the tomb's coolness and the valley's furnace. The smell of hot rock, intensified by confinement in the tomb's narrow corridors, releases somewhat in this open air, though the valley itself offers little relief, its stone walls reflecting and concentrating the heat until the shade of midday seems only a darker kind of brightness. Carr sits with his team, the right side, each with a foreman who eats apart, reviewing the morning's progress, planning the afternoon's continuation. The bread is dense, the fish salty, the water warm from its skin container, and the meal passes in the exhaustion of those who have worked in darkness, their eyes still adjusting to the sun's assault. The left side team emerges from their separate entrance, and the two teams do not mingle, their separation maintained even in rest, the division of labor extending to division of social space. You watch them from where you sit with Carr, their foreman gesturing, their apprentices carrying the remains of their meal back to storage jars. The famous strike of year 29 of Rameses III, approximately 1159 BCE, began when grain rations were delayed, and this strike, documented in papyrus Turin 1880, is the first recorded labor strike in history. The memory of this event, though it occurred before Carr's birth, shapes the present negotiations between village and state, the careful accounting of rations, the vigilance of the village self-governing institutions against any recurrence of such failure. This structure enabled the collective action that produced the strike, that recorded it, that preserved its memory as both warning and precedent. The afternoon returns Carr to the astronomical ceiling, the orpiment yellow now mixed with white for the stars' centers, the Egyptian blue surrounding each point of light. You watch him work with increasing slowness, the morning's energy dissipated, the body asserting its own rhythms against the demands of the project. The taste of dust has become merely present, no longer noticed except in the occasional cough that interrupts the brush's movement. The coolness of the tomb's deepest chamber seems to call from below, where the left side team works in their own lamplight, their own dust, their own accumulating exhaustion. The painted gods receive their final touches for this day, the varnish that will protect them, the details that complete their iconographic significance, their power to accompany the dead. The boy apprentice grinds malachite for green, the stone reduced to powder on a flat pallet, and his afternoon task is preparation for tomorrow, for the days after, for the weeks that this tomb's decoration will require. You see in his methodical movement the replication of his own training, the transmission of skill across generations that Deir el-Medina has perfected through its centuries of existence. This span of nearly 500 years produced a community whose specialization, whose isolation, whose self-governance created a culture as distinctive as any in the Black Land. Women in the village were literate at higher rates than elsewhere. Letters and legal documents survive, and this literacy, this documentary habit, means that the boy's training includes not merely grinding and painting, but the possibility of writing, of recording, of participating in the administrative life that the village autonomy requires. The return at evening, backs aching from bending, eyes strained from lamplight in darkness, begins when the foreman's call echoes through the corridors. You follow Carr upward, the climb steeper for tired legs, the lamp's flame guttering in the jar's diminished oil. The corridor's painted gods recede into darkness behind, their colors still vivid after millennia, but invisible now, waiting for tomorrow's lamplight, waiting for the completion that will seal them in darkness for eternity. The smell of hot rock greets the emergence from the tomb's mouth, the evening air still warm but cooling, the sun already touching the western cliffs that shelter Deir el-Medina from the full violence of afternoon heat. The path over the ridge reverses the morning's journey, and Carr walks more slowly now, the jar of lamp oil empty in his hand, his back bent from hours of reaching upward. You feel the descent in your own knees, the loose scream more treacherous for tired feet, the larger stones placed deliberately by earlier generations, now merely obstacles to be navigated in the gathering dusk. The sound of chisels and stone hammers has ceased, their day ending earlier, their labor more directly governed by the sun's presence. The village appears below, its small houses with their 3 to 4 rooms, their upper stories, their cellars, receiving the returning workers into their familiar spaces, their domestic routines, their evening meals. Carr enters his house, and you stand in the doorway watching the village evening settle over the narrow wadi. The small temple of Hathor receives the last light, its stele dedicated to deified kings and local gods casting long shadows across the central path. The village had its own small temples and numerous stelae dedicated to deified kings and local gods, and these structures mark the sacred geography that parallels the domestic, the administrative, the working spaces of this community. Tomb workers were buried in tombs they themselves decorated in the hills around the village, and Carr knows that his own burial place waits in preparation, that his skill will produce the decoration of his own eternal house, that the painted gods will surround his own body when the time comes. The evening meal is bread and beer, onion and dried fish, the same foods that sustain the working life, the same tastes that mark the continuity of existence in Deir el-Medina. You sit with Carr in the house's main room, the upper story silent where his children have already slept, the cellar sealed where the remaining grain waits for tomorrow's need. Tomorrow may bring a dispute to adjudicate, a ration to distribute, a letter to write for one of the literate women whose documents survive from this place, whose voices reach across the centuries in complaints, in contracts, in the ordinary negotiations of domestic and public life. The lamp burns low, and Carr prepares his jar for tomorrow's oil, the small container that begins each day, that enables the work in darkness, that produces the painted gods emerging from darkness as the lamp moves, their colors still vivid after millennia. You watch him seal the jar, set it by the door, perform the small rituals of preparation that make the morning's departure possible, that reduce the friction of transition between rest and labor. This small population, this intensive community, produces the royal tombs that assert the eternity of kings, that preserve the memory of power against the erosion of time. Sleep comes slowly to Carr, his back still aching from bending, his eyes still seeing the afterimages of lamplight in darkness, the colors floating across the darkness of closed lids. You remain awake in the house's silence, listening to the night sounds of the village, the occasional movement of others similarly afflicted, similarly resting before tomorrow's repetition. This span of centuries will eventually end, the village abandoned after the end of the New Kingdom, its location forgotten until rediscovery. But that ending is distant from this night, from Carr's slow breathing, from the jar of lamp oil waiting by the door, from the path over the ridge that will be walked again before dawn. Again and again, in the measured parcel of time that the tomb painters preserve, that the tomb painters measure, that the tomb painters, in their painting, in their waiting, in their patient repetition, make and unmake and make again. The coolness of the tomb's deepest chamber, where the sarcophagus will rest, year-round, seems to reach across the ridge in Carr's dreams, a darkness within darkness, a preparation within preparation. You feel it too, the stone's indifference to human purpose, the permanence that the painters merely decorate, the eternity that they assert but do not create. The village settles into the silence of its narrow wadi, the small houses containing the breathing of 200 to 300 people, the accumulated exhaustion of 8 days out of 10, with 2 days off, in the valley across the ridge. The night deepens, and the stars that Carr paints on the astronomical ceiling wheel overhead, the same stars, the same patterns, the same divine order that the ceiling asserts and the sky demonstrates. You stand at the house's doorway looking upward, and the cliffs of Deir el-Medina frame a rectangle of darkness that holds these lights, that contains this view as the tomb contains its painted gods, as the village contains its workers, as the New Kingdom contains its centuries of royal burial, of artisan labor, of self-governing community in the narrow wadi between the high cliffs and the steeper ridge. The lamp oil in the small jar waits, and Carr sleeps, and the village of the tomb painters sleeps with him, all of it waiting, all of it preparing, all of it continuing in the darkness that precedes the dawn at the ridge's crest, at the Valley of the Kings, in the Black Land, in the measured parcel of time that the tomb painters preserve, that the tomb painters measure, that the tomb painters, in their painting, in their waiting, in their patient repetition, make and unmake and make again. The night still holds the west bank of the river in its final hours, and you are standing at the edge of the sacred lake at Karnak, at the temple complex of Amun-Ra at Thebes, across the river from Deir el-Medina, across the river from the village of the tomb painters. The water is black and motionless, reflecting no stars, and the air carries the faint sweetness of decay from the gardens beyond the enclosure wall. Around you, the great temple complex extends in darkness, its pylons and courts and chambers built and rebuilt across centuries, growing continuously from the Middle Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period, each king adding his measure of stone to the house of the god. A figure approaches the lake's margin, his white linen visible even in this light. He is a Wab priest, one of the pure ones, and his month of service has begun. You watch him pause at the water's edge, where the steps descend into cold darkness. He removes his sandals, and the sound of leather against stone is brief and hollow. The water moves across his feet, then his calves, then his thighs as he descends. The priest immerses himself completely, and the ripples spread outward in concentric circles that lap against the stone coping, against the reeds, against the darkness that contains them. He rises, and the water streams from his shaved head, from his shoulders, from the linen he will now change for a fresh garment. The taste of purity is in his mouth, for he has fasted since yesterday's sunset, abstaining from certain foods, washing repeatedly, preparing his body to enter the presence of the god. The sky above the eastern pylons has begun to pale, not with color yet, but with the subtraction of absolute black, the first loosening of night. You follow the Wab priest as he moves through the outer court, past the Sphinx Avenue where the ram-headed figures stand in rows, their bodies worn smooth by centuries of wind and by the touch of countless pilgrims. The stone is cool beneath your own feet, and the sand that has blown across the pavement grinds softly with each step. The Temple of Amun at Karnak owned approximately 20% of Egypt's arable land by the New Kingdom, and this wealth is visible in the mass of construction around you, in the workshops and magazines and priestly residences that cluster against the enclosure walls, in the agricultural estates that extend beyond sight, in the herds of cattle whose lowing you can sometimes hear at dawn. The priest approaches the inner precinct, where the darkness remains more complete, where the great pylons cast shadows that the approaching sun has not yet penetrated. He is joined by others, higher in the hierarchy, and together they prepare for the morning ritual that begins before dawn with the awakening of the god. The pharaoh was theoretically the chief priest, but delegated duties to this hierarchy, to the Wab priests and the Sem priests and the higher ranks, each with their month of service rotation, each with their portion of the divine labor. You stand at the threshold of the hypostyle hall, and the coolness of the stone columns envelops you, their massive bulk creating permanent shadow even at noon, even at the height of the sun's power. And now in this hour before dawn they are columns of darkness, of weight, of the silence that precedes speech. The sanctuary door is sealed with clay, with the imprint of the previous day's guardian, and the breaking of this seal is a sound you will hear clearly. A crack, a small crumbling, the release of air that has been held since yesterday's closing. Within, the cult statue housed in the innermost sanctuary awaits the lamplight alone, awaits the first human presence since the previous evening's departure. The temples were considered houses for the gods, and this innermost space is the god's private chamber, the place where the divine dwells in darkness throughout the hours of night, undisturbed, unobserved, complete in itself. The lamplight enters now, carried by the Wab priest whose purification you witnessed, and the gold of the statue catches this small flame, returns it amplified, concentrated, made strange by the eyes of divinity. Incense rises, and the offering of the morning meal is laid before the god. The smell of kai-fi fills the confined space, the complex temple incense of honey, wine, raisins, myrrh, and juniper, compounded according to ancient recipes, burned in quantities that mark the wealth of the house of Ammon. The smoke rises in visible columns, twists in the lamplight, disperses against the painted ceiling where the stars of the goddess Nut are depicted, where the solar bark moves in its eternal circuit. The priest speaks the words of awakening, the liturgy that has been spoken in this chamber for centuries, that grew continuously from the Middle Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period, that will continue until the temple itself is sand and the river has changed its course. The god is washed, the god is dressed, the god is fed. Each action is performed with implements of precious metal, with linen of the finest weave, with gestures that have been prescribed and repeated until they have become indistinguishable from the structure of the world. You are present at this, standing in the shadows beyond the lamplight, and the warmth of the incense smoke moves across your face, carries with it the sweetness of honey, the dark depth of myrrh, the sharp note of juniper. The taste of purity still governs the priest's movements, his silence, the precise economy of his gestures. The morning meal is placed before the statue, and later it will be removed, will be distributed, will become the substance that sustains the priesthood, that flows from the god's abundance to the human community that serves him. The first true light enters the sanctuary now, not through the door, but through the clerestory, through the stone grille that separates the chamber from the sky. The dawn light striking the obelisk's gilded pyramidion sends a brief flash visible across the river, visible from Deir el-Medina, from the village of the tomb painters, from the ridge above the Valley of the Kings. The tallest surviving obelisk is that of Hatshepsut, 29.56 meters, and it stands in the court you crossed in darkness, its granite surface catching this first sun, its pyramidion of electrum blazing for a moment before the light equalizes, before the flash becomes steady illumination. Obelisks were erected by Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, and later kings, each a single piece of granite, each quarried at Aswan and transported by barge down the Nile during the inundation, each a frozen ray of the sun, a permanent moment of dawn extracted from time and raised above the temple's mass. You move now from the inner sanctuary, from the house of the god, through the courts that are opening to the morning, through the spaces where the general population will soon gather, where they will participate in festivals and make offerings at outer courts, where they will not enter the inner temple but will stand at the threshold of the divine presence, will receive its blessing, will return to their fields and workshops and homes sustained by this contact. The temple owned extensive agricultural estates, workshops, and herds, making it an economic powerhouse, and this wealth is visible in the grain stored in the magazines, in the gold worked in the temple workshops, in the cattle that graze on temple lands, in the network of obligation and redistribution that binds the black land together. The river is visible now from the outer court, and on its surface, a barge bearing a new obelisk moves slowly on floodwaters, its weight requiring multiple vessels lashed together. The inundation has come, and the water is high, and the transport of this single piece of granite from the quarries at Aswan proceeds with the current, with the measured pace of stone that cannot be hurried. You watch from the quay as the massive cargo passes, as the ropes strain, as the rowers on the accompanying vessels maintain position, as the obelisks make their journey toward the temple complex that will receive them, that will raise them, that will bind them to the sky. The water is the color of the fertile soil it has spread across the fields, and the sound of it against the hulls is deep, is continuous, is the sound of weight supported by fluid, of stone made momentarily light by the river's embrace. The day progresses, and the heat builds in the outer courts where the population gathers. You move through these spaces, and the coolness of the hypostyle hall's stone columns draws you back into shadow, their massive bulk creating permanent refuge where the temperature drops noticeably, where the air seems to hold moisture, where the painted reliefs retain their color in this protection from the sun. The smell of Kai-Fi lingers here too, deposited in the stone over centuries of burning, released by the warmth of each day, a permanent atmosphere of the temple's function, of its continuous operation from the Middle Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period. The Opit festival, celebrated in the second month of Akit, approaches, and the preparations are visible throughout the complex. The bark of Ammon is being readied, the portable shrine that will carry the god's presence from Karnak to Luxor Temple by procession, that will move along the temple axis and to other temples, that will allow the population to witness what they cannot otherwise approach. This linkage was the binding of the two shores, the two temples, the two manifestations of divine presence into a single ceremonial movement. You watch the craftsmen who gild the bark, who repair the tow ropes, who prepare the carrying poles that the priests will bear upon their shoulders. The sound of sistrum rattles and menet necklaces shaken by chantresses echoes from the practice chambers, and you follow this sound to where the women of the temple choir rehearse their movements, their music, their role in the approaching festival. The sistrum is the sound of divine presence, the menet necklace shaken in rhythmic accompaniment, and together they create the sonic environment of procession, of the god's movement through space, of the transformation of the static temple into the mobile shrine that can reach the population, that can extend blessing beyond the enclosure walls. The chantresses are not priests in the formal hierarchy, not wob priests or sem-priests, but their function is essential to the festival's efficacy, to the creation of the atmosphere in which the divine can move among humans without danger, without violation of the necessary boundaries. Oracle ceremonies allow the god to answer questions through movements of the bark carried by priests, and you have witnessed these too in other seasons, in other months of service. The bearers move in procession, and the bark sways, turns, advances or retreats according to a logic that is not human, that is read by the interpreting priests, that conveys the god's will to those who have posed their questions, who have brought their offerings, who have prepared themselves to receive this communication. The general population could not enter the inner temple, but participated in festivals and made offerings at outer courts, and the oracle extended this participation, gave it voice, gave it the particularity of response that the static cult could not provide. The day of the Opit festival arrives, and you are standing in the great court as the bark of Ammon emerges from the inner sanctuary, as the god who was awakened before dawn, who was washed and dressed and fed, who was left alone in darkness until tomorrow's awakening, now emerges to travel, to process, to extend his presence along the route to Luxor. The bark moves slowly, borne by priests who are themselves in states of purity, who have fasted and washed and abstained, who carry the weight of the god's presence upon their shoulders and in their muscles, and in the concentration that maintains the proper movement. The Opit procession moves from Karnak to Luxor, and you walk with it through the Sphinx Avenue, past the quays where you watch the obelisk pass, along the processional way that has been cleared and decorated for this occasion. The smell of Kai-Fi precedes the bark, burned in censers that swing from poles carried by attendants, the complex temple incense of honey, wine, raisins, myrrh, and juniper marking the god's approach, preparing the air for his presence. The populace lining the route throws flowers, makes brief prayers, reaches out to touch the fringe of the canopy that shades the bark, to receive in this contact a portion of the divine power that passes among them. The sun reaches its height, and the procession pauses at the stations that have been prepared along the route, where the bark rests in temporary shrines, where additional offerings are made, where the priests refresh themselves, where the rhythm of movement and rest structures the day. You stand in the shade of one of these stations, and the coolness of its stone columns, their massive bulk creating shadow, gives respite from the heat that has built since dawn. The taste of purity is in your own mouth now, for you have fasted in sympathy with the priests, have prepared yourself for this participation, this witnessing of the gods' movement through the landscape of Thebes. The bark reaches Luxor Temple as the light begins to soften, as the shadows lengthen, as the heat begins to dissipate. The god will rest here, will be installed in the sanctuary prepared for him, will receive the evening offerings, will be left alone in darkness until tomorrow's awakening, until the return procession that will complete the cycle of the festival. But you do not remain for this installation. You return to Karnak, to the temple complex of Amun-Ra at Thebes, to the temple that grew continuously from the Middle Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period, to the temple that owned approximately 20% of Egypt's arable land by the New Kingdom, to the temple where the daily rhythm continues regardless of festival, where the priests are divided into pure ones and higher ranks, with monthly service rotations, where the economic powerhouse of the god's house continues its operations through the evening and into the night. The sun sets behind the western mountains, and the sky above the temple deepens through shades of rose and amber into the darkness that will hold until dawn. You are standing in the great court, and the obelisks erected by Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, and later kings stand against this darkening, their silhouettes precise against the sky, their single pieces of granite absorbing the last light, releasing it slowly into the cooling air. The tallest surviving obelisk, that of Hatshepsut at 29.56 meters, no longer gilded as it once was, no longer sends the brief flash visible across the river, but stands in its weathered dignity as the stars emerge, as the constellations of the Egyptian sky take their positions, as the night progresses toward the hour before dawn when the cycle will begin again. The temple closes, and the god is left alone in darkness until tomorrow's awakening. You hear the final sounds of the evening ritual, the closing of doors, the application of seals, the retreat of footsteps on stone. The smell of kai-fi lingers in the outer courts, the complex temple incense of honey, wine, raisins, myrrh, and juniper deposited in the stone, released by the day's warmth, now slowly cooling. The sacred lake is black again, motionless, reflecting the stars that have emerged in the absence of moon. You stand at its edge, where the Wab priest purified himself in darkness, where the cold water received his immersion, where the taste of purity began the sequence that will repeat tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, that has repeated since the Middle Kingdom, that will continue through the Ptolemaic period, and beyond, that is the measured parcel of time that the temple preserves, that the temple measures, that the temple, in its ritual, in its waiting, in its patient repetition, makes and unmake, and makes again. The coolness of the hypostyle hall's stone columns reaches you even here, their massive bulk creating permanent shadow that extends beyond their physical presence, that becomes the atmosphere of the temple, the condition of its existence. Across the river, Deir el-Medina is dark. The village of the tomb painters sleeps, and Kar sleeps with it, and the jar waits, and all of it continues in the darkness that precedes the dawn at the ridge's crest, at the Valley of the Kings, in the Black Land. But here at Karnak, at the principal temple complex of Amun-Ra at Thebes, the god is present in his darkness, undisturbed, complete, awaiting the hour when the Wab priest will again descend the steps into the sacred lake, when the sanctuary will again be opened, when the seal will again be broken, when the cult statue housed in the innermost sanctuary will again be revealed to lamplight alone, when the incense will again rise, when the offering of the morning meal will again be laid before the god, when the temple that was considered a house for the gods will again fulfill its function, will again be the place where the divine and human meet in the measured rhythm that sustains the world, that preserves the Black Land, that continues, that waits, that prepares, that makes and makes again in the patient repetition of dawn. The river lies beneath a skin of mist that has not yet burned away, and you are standing at the harbour at dawn, where the water meets the bank in a silence broken only by the hollow knock of boats against wooden posts. The air moves across your face with the particular coolness that belongs to early morning, carrying with it the smell of fish drying on reed racks, the smell of fermentation from the beer brewing area beyond the first cluster of mud brick walls, the smell of human and animal sweat that has not yet intensified with the heat of full day. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes, though formal shops are rare in this place, and most exchange will be barter, grain and metal serving as measures of value in transactions conducted by eye and argued by gesture. Markets existed at river landings, temple gates, and crossroads throughout the Black Land, though the permanence of dedicated commerce belonged more to the great cities than to this working bank where fishermen and washerwomen and potters begin their labor as the light strengthens. A fisherman pushes his papyrus skiff into the morning mist, the reed bundle hissing against water that has not yet lost the chill of night. You watch him from the bank where your feet press into mud, still soft with dew, and you feel the give of the earth beneath your sandals, which are made of leather or woven papyrus, essential in a hot climate where the ground itself can raise blisters by midday. The skiff is lightweight and buoyant, constructed from bundles of papyrus reed lashed with cordage of flax, and the fisherman uses such vessels for net and line, fishing in the river and canals that thread through the agricultural land. The cast net and the seine were common tools in his trade, and the larger fish that he sought included Nile perch, catfish, and mullet, creatures of the deep channels and the quieter backwaters. His wife mends nets on the bank, the cordage of flax rough between her fingers, the smell of fish already on her hands from the previous day's catch that she helped to clean and dry. You notice the way her body moves with the repetition of the work, the needle of bone passing through mesh, the knots forming with a consistency born of years of practice in her shoulders. The mist continues to lift in thin veils, revealing more of the river's surface, the brown water moving with a current that carries debris from upstream, fragments of papyrus, occasional driftwood, the detritus of a civilization that lives with its waterway in intimacy. The sound of wooden pestles in mortars reaches you from somewhere behind the first rank of activity, the grinding of grain a constant background to market activity that will intensify as the sun climbs. A deben of copper weighed about 91 grams in the measuring system of this world, and a shat was a unit of value, not weight, roughly 7.5 grams of gold, and these measures would be invoked in the negotiations that would soon fill this space with voices. Most exchange was barter, the direct transfer of goods for goods, though grain and metal served as measures of value that allowed comparison between unlike things, a length of copper against a basket of dried fish, a jar of beer against a length of woven linen. A washerwoman beats a noble's linen on a flat stone at the water's edge, the rhythmic thwack carrying across the morning quiet with a regularity that seems to mark the time itself. You are standing near enough to observe the play of her arms, the garment lifted and struck, the water running from it in streams that darken the stone before running back to the river. The white linen spread on bushes to dry creates a temporary landscape of cleanliness, a strange domestic architecture that will stand for a few hours before the heat completes its work. Washerwomen worked at the riverbank throughout the Black Land, beating cloth on stones and drying it on bushes or lines, their labor essential to the maintenance of status and hygiene in a climate where dust and sweat accumulated with relentless speed. The feel of papyrus rope, rough and fibrous, cuts slightly into your palm when you reach to steady yourself against a mooring post, and you understand in this small sensation the nature of hauling, of pulling against current and weight, that defines so much of the labor here. The sun has risen above the mist now, and the light falls with the particular clarity that belongs to morning in this valley, the long shadows of boats and reed racks stretching across the mud of the bank. A potter shapes a beer jar on his wheel near a water source, the clay scented by years of practice in his shoulders, his foot working the kick wheel with a rhythm that matches his breathing. Potters worked near water sources throughout the settlements of the Black Land, using Nile silt clay tempered with sand or straw to create vessels that would hold the necessities of daily life, the beer and grain oil, the water and the preserved foods. The clay rises beneath his wet hands, the form emerging from the spinning mass, the neck narrowing, the shoulder rounding, the lip forming under the pressure of his thumb, and the edge of a wooden tool. You can smell the wet earth of his material, the particular mineral scent of Nile silt, and beyond it, the stronger smell of fermentation from the beer brewing area where the process continues that transforms barley bread into the staple drink of this world. Beer was brewed from barley bread, partially baked, broken into water, and fermented in large vats that stood in the brewery compound, and the taste of fresh beer, still slightly sweet, drunk from a pottery cup with a foam of fermentation, belongs to the afternoon that approaches from this morning beginning. You will taste it later, perhaps, if your path takes you through the market at its height, the cup passed from a brewer's hand, the liquid warm from the vat, the sweetness giving way to a more complex flavor as the fermentation continues its work. A skilled tomb worker received about 4 or 5 sacks of emmer wheat per month as base rations, and this measure of sustenance, this calculation of bread and beer against labor, underlies all the exchange that will fill this bank as the day progresses. The fisherman has reached the deeper water now, his skiff a small shape against the widening river, the mist a memory only in the cooler pockets of air that linger near the bank. His wife continues her mending, the net spread across her knees, the damaged sections marked by darker cord where new material has been woven in. The smell of fish drying intensifies as the sun warms the racks, a pervasive presence that will not diminish until evening, and you understand that this odor belongs to the livelihood of this place, the exchange of river harvest for the products of field and workshop. The names and practices settle into memory through repetition rather than declaration. The cast net and the seine, the Nile perch and catfish and mullet, the lightweight skiffs of bundled reed, all becoming part of your awareness as you observe the activity around you. A carpenter works at a bench near the potter's wheel, his tools of copper and bronze glinting as they shape the acacia, sycamore, and imported cedar that come to his hands from different sources, the local woods and the precious imports that arrive by river from the distant ports. Carpenters worked these materials using copper and bronze tools that required frequent sharpening and replacement, the metal softer than the iron that would come later, but sufficient for the joinery and carving that this world demanded. You observe the curl of wood rising from his adze, the pale interior of the sycamore revealing itself as the rough exterior falls away, the grain pattern emerging like a map of the tree's history, its seasons of growth and dormancy, its years of drinking from the water that now flows past this very bank. The heat has begun to build, and the smell of human and animal sweat mingles now with the fish and fermentation, the composite odor of a working market that has no need to disguise its nature. Jewelers worked gold, silver, electrum, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and turquoise from Sinai, and though their workshops may not open directly onto this riverbank, their products will appear in the exchange that fills the morning, the small weights of precious material passing from palm to palm with the particular care that value demands. You do not see the jewelers at this hour, but you know their work from the occasional glint at a throat or wrist among the better-dressed figures who move through the market, the wigs of human hair or vegetable fiber that mark the elites for comfort and status, the cosmetics that include kohl for eye protection and adornment, and ochre for lip and cheek color. The kohl, derived from galena, protects the eyes from the glare that will become intense by midday, and you notice its application on several of the women who pass, the dark line defining the eye's shape, the mineral sparkle catching the light. The ochre for lip and cheek color appears more subtly, a warmth against the skin that speaks of preparation and presentation even in this working space. Wigs of human hair or vegetable fiber were worn by elites for comfort and status, and you observe the distinction between those who wear them and those whose own hair, cut short or bound back, speaks of more immediate practical concerns. The distinction is not rigid, the market mixing all conditions in its necessary commerce, but it marks the eye even when unremarked. A barter at the landing draws your attention. The dried fish for a length of copper, measured by eye and argued by gesture between a fisherman returned from his morning's work and a merchant whose trade takes him inland to the workshops and the larger houses. The copper is weighed in the hand, the debon estimated by experience rather than scale, the negotiation proceeding in a language of raised eyebrows and extended palms, of goods displayed and withdrawn, of values asserted and compromised. This transaction exemplifies the system, the direct usefulness of the fish against the stored and transferable value of the metal, the needs of the present moment against the possibilities of future exchange. The fisherman will take the copper to the potter perhaps, or to the sandal maker, or he will keep it against a larger need. The metals wait a small security in a world of uncertainty. The sound of wooden pestles in mortars continues from behind you, the grinding of grain a constant background to market activity that has now reached its morning intensity. You turn from the barter to observe the fuller scene, the white linen spread on bushes to dry catching the light in patches of temporary brightness, the washerwoman's thwack now joined by others along the bank, a syncopated rhythm of cleaning that speaks of the previous day's use and the perpetual renewal that this world requires. The feel of papyrus rope has left its slight impression in your palm, a memory of the mooring post, and you understand how such rope, when used for hauling, would cut more deeply, would demand the protection of wrapped cloth or the callous of accustomed labor. The potter's wheel still turns, the beer jar now complete, set aside to dry with others in a row that represents the morning's production, the forms identical in their functional simplicity, the variation of handwork visible only to the practiced eye. The proximity to the river serves the double purpose of material and market, the clay carried from the bank, the finished vessels carried to it for distribution. The smell of wet earth mingles with the stronger smell of fermentation from the beer brewing area, the two odors related in their origin, the grain that becomes beer, the earth that becomes vessel, the transformation of natural material into human necessity. Hunting in the marshes provided fowl, fish, and hippopotamus, the latter dangerous but prized for meat and ivory. And though you do not observe such hunting directly on this bank, you know that the marshes begin not far upstream, the papyrus thickets where the river spreads and slows, where the dangerous animals maintain their presence against the encroachment of cultivation. The hippopotamus, in particular, represents a paradox of value and threat, its meat desirable, its ivory precious, its temper unpredictable and deadly, the hunters who pursue it equipped with harpoons and the courage of necessity. The memory of such hunting informs the market even in its absence, the ivory appearing occasionally in the goods of specialized traders, the reference to marsh dangers part of the common knowledge of river life. The sun has passed its morning angle, and the light falls more directly now, the shadows shortening, the heat intensifying with a predictability that shapes the day's rhythm. You move through the market, your sandals protecting your feet from the heated ground, the mud of morning now drying to cracked earth in the exposed areas. The taste of fresh beer reaches you from a brewer's stall, the cup passed across a rough counter, the transaction brief, the drink immediate and necessary in the building warmth, the liquid warm from the vat, the sweetness giving way to more complex flavor as the fermentation continues its work. This small pleasure, too, is underwritten by the measure of sustenance against labor, the beer against the copper or the grain that represents the brewer's return for his effort and material. The market has reached its fullness now, the voices overlapping, the gestures of exchange repeated in variations throughout the space, the goods displayed and considered and transferred. The fisherman who pushed his papyrus skiff into the morning mist has returned, his catch added to the drying racks, his wife's mending now proven necessary by the morning's use. The washerwoman's rhythmic thwack has ceased, her linen now spread in the full heat, the temporary landscape of cleanliness complete for this phase of the day. The potter shapes another jar, the clay scented by years of practice in his shoulders, the repetition of his craft, a form of meditation visible to any who stand long enough to observe. Evening approaches with a slowness that belongs to this latitude, the sun's descent prolonged, the heat lingering even as the light begins to shift toward the colors of ending. The market disperses, the unsold fish smoked for tomorrow, the bank emptying of voices in a gradual withdrawal that mirrors the morning's gathering. You remain as the light changes, the white linen now taken from the bushes, the dried fabric folded against the body of the washerwoman as she departs, the potter's wheel stilled, the carpenter's bench covered with a cloth against the night's dew. The smell of fish drying persists, intensified by the smoking process, the preparation for tomorrow's market already begun in the ending of today's. The river continues its movement, the brown water carrying its burden of debris, the papyrus skiffs drawn up on the bank, the reed bundles hissing no longer against water, but against the mud of landing. The sound of wooden pestles in mortars has ceased, the grinding of grain completed for this day, the constant background to market activity now replaced by a quieter sound, the murmur of the river itself, the occasional call of water birds, the distant bark of dogs in the settled areas beyond the bank. The smell of fermentation from the beer brewing area continues, the process not interrupted by the day's ending, the transformation of barley bred into drink proceeding through the night in the covered vats. You stand at the riverbank as the light fails, the heat releasing its hold, the coolness of evening moving across your face with a gentleness that belongs to this hour. Markets existed at river landings, temple gates and crossroads, though formal shops were rare, and this place, now emptying, will fill again with the same necessity, the same exchange, the same measured repetition of need and satisfaction. A deben of copper weighed about 91 grams, and a shat was a unit of value, not weight, roughly 7.5 grams of gold, and these measures will be invoked again when the market resumes, the grain and metal serving as measures of value in the barter that defines this economy. The fisherman and his wife have departed with their nets, and their catch, the dried fish for smoking carried to the preparation area, the papyrus skiff drawn up and secured. The cast net and the seine were common, and the larger fish included Nile perch, catfish and mullet, and these facts belong to tomorrow as they belong to today, the repetition not tedious but sustaining, the pattern of labor and exchange that continues through the seasons. The last of the merchants has gone, the bank now empty of voices, the temporary landscape of cleanliness replaced by the darkness of evening, the white linen invisible until tomorrow's spreading. The feel of papyrus rope, rough and fibrous, remains in your memory, the slight cutting into the palm when hauling, the texture of this world's materials against the skin. Your own feet, protected through the day by sandals of leather or woven papyrus, now sense the cooling ground, the change that evening brings to all surfaces. The potter's beer jars stand in their row, drying through the night, the clay losing its moisture in preparation for the firing that will transform it to ceramic, the vessel that will hold the beer brewed from barley bread, partially baked, broken into water and fermented. The taste of fresh beer belongs to tomorrow now, the brewer's work continuing in darkness, the transformation invisible but assured. Cosmetics included kohl for eye protection and adornment, and ochre for lip and cheek color, and these preparations too will resume with the light, the presentation of self that accompanies all public activity in this world. Carpenters worked acacia, sycamore, and imported cedar, using copper and bronze tools, and their benches will be active again with the dawn, the curl of wood rising, the grain pattern emerging. The stars begin to appear above the river, the darkness complete enough now for their light, the mist that will return before dawn not yet formed. You remain at the bank, the water moving past, the settlement behind you quiet in its evening rest, the labor of the day stored in body and goods, the preparation for tomorrow already begun in the smoking of fish, the drying of pots, the continued fermentation of beer. The measured rhythm sustains, the patient repetition of dawn that continues, that waits, that prepares, that makes and unmake, and makes again in the cycle that preserves the black land, that fulfills the function of all labor, all exchange, all the small and necessary transactions that constitute a civilization's daily life. The heat of the day is leaving the mud brick now, rising slowly into the darkening sky as you stand upon the roof of a house in Deir el-Medina. Around you, the village exhales. The day's labor in the tombs of the valley has ended, and the workers have returned through the wadi path that will lie empty until tomorrow's dawn. You feel the first coolness of night, air moving across your skin, still warm from the sun that has slipped behind the western cliffs. The breeze carries the smell of burning castor oil, thick and slightly acrid, from a pottery lamp that someone has already lit below. A grandmother settles onto a woven mat near the roof's edge, her grandchildren gathering close as the sky deepens from lapis to black. She points toward the eastern horizon, where the first decans are beginning to rise, those 36 star groups whose heliacal rising occurs at 10-day intervals throughout the year. You watch her finger trace invisible lines between the points of light, and you hear her voice naming them, telling their stories, repeating the names that Egyptian astronomy has given to the patterns above. The decans mark the hours of the night, she explains, as they have marked them for generations beyond counting. The children murmur the names after her, their voices soft in the darkness. The sky goddess Nut arches above you, her body marked with stars, the Milky Way a visible river across her form in this sky without electric light. The grandmother speaks of Nut's eternal embrace, how she swallows the sun each evening and births it each dawn, how her body contains all the decans in their measured progression. You look up at the darkness and see the truth of this, the vast figure stretched from horizon to horizon, her head in the west where the sun has gone, her feet in the east where the stars now rise. The northern sky holds the circumpolar stars, the imperishable ones, the realm of the afterlife where the dead journey at night. This knowledge makes sleep a liminal state, a threshold where the living rest near the realm where the dead travel. Below, on the main floor, a mother prepares the evening bread, the main meal often eaten after sunset in hot seasons when the roof provides coolness that the lower rooms cannot offer. You smell the bread still warm from the oven, and you taste it later with a paste of lentils and onion, the simple nourishment that follows the day's labor. The family gathers as evening deepens, the pattern of their lives shaped by the heat that drives them upward at night and downward at dawn. A dog barks across the fields, the sound carrying in the still air, and another answers from somewhere beyond the village wall. Then silence returns, the brief conversation of animals marking the boundaries of human settlement. 2 children have brought out a Senate board, the grid of 30 squares marked in the lamplight, and they settle to their game with throws of knuckly bones that click against the roof's surface. You watch their pieces move through the squares, the game progressing in patterns that mirror the decans above, the 30 squares perhaps echoing the 30 days of each month in the Egyptian civil calendar. That calendar holds 365 days, 12 months of 30 days plus 5 epigonal days that stand apart, belonging to no month, sacred to the gods. The children do not know this connection, or if they do not speak of it, absorbed in the movement of their pieces, the competition of the game. The grandmother continues her naming of the stars, and you hear her speak of Soptit, the most important star, whose heliacal rising marks the new year and the onset of the flood. Soptit is Sirius, the brightest point in the sky, and the Egyptians have watched for her appearance with anxious hope for millennia. The grandmother repeats the name Soptit 3 times, as if the repetition itself might call the star forth, might ensure the flood that sustains the Black Land. She speaks too of Sar, the constellation the Egyptians identified with Orion, and of the stellar mythology that connects Osiris with Sar, Isis with Soptit. The dead Osiris becomes the pattern of stars in the southern sky, his wife the brightest star following him, the myth written across the darkness in light. A man sits apart from the family gathering, his back against the low wall that rims the roof. He is a tomb painter, home from the valley, and you see him rub his eyes in the dim light of the oil lamp, his fingers pressing against lids that have stared too long at darkness, painted to resemble darkness. His dreams, when they come, will already be full of darkness, the black pigment ground and applied, the careful work of making the unseen world visible for the dead. He does not join the children's game or the grandmother's instruction. He watches the stars without naming them, perhaps seeing in their patterns the ceilings he has decorated, the Ramesside star clocks that adorn the royal tombs with the decans in sequence. He has painted those decans, has placed them in order for the dead to read the hours of their eternal night. The Egyptian civil calendar drifts against the solar year by about 1 day every 4 years, a wandering year that slowly loses alignment with the seasons it was meant to track. The grandmother knows this, or knows something like it, some observation that the new year of Soptit's rising comes later and later against the calendar's count, that the gods' days no longer match the gods' appearances. Yet the calendar persists, its 365 days unyielding, the epigonal days still set aside, the 12-month still marching in their 30-day progression. The drift is accepted, perhaps, as all slow changes are accepted, as the heat is accepted, as the flood is accepted when it comes, and when it withholds itself. You feel the coolness of night air moving more strongly now, the first breeze after a still day finding its way across the roof, into the spaces between bodies, into the folds of linen. The pottery lamp flickers in the air's movement, its flame bending toward the wick of linen that draws the castor oil upward. The smell of burning oil intensifies with the breeze, then settles again as the air stills. The lamp is of simple make, the pottery shaped by hands that know the form from repetition, the function from necessity. Other lamps in the village burn similar oil, similar fat, their wicks similar linen, the pattern of evening light repeating across the mud brick houses, the stone houses, the dwellings of Deir el-Medina that house the workers of the royal tombs. A scribe sits in the room below, finished with his day's copying, his hands now forming a letter to his brother in another gnome, the ink drying by the last of the oil in his own lamp. You do not see him, but you know he is there, the scratch of his reed pen against papyrus, a sound that barely reaches the roof, drowned by the grandmother's voice, the children's game, the settling of the house into evening. His letter carries news of family, of health, of the small events that bind scattered relatives across the distances of the Black Land. The ink he uses is carbon black, the same darkness the tomb painter grinds, the same darkness that fills the sky above the roof where you stand. When he finishes, The letter will wait for a messenger, for a traveler, for some connection between the gnomes that time and opportunity may provide. The Milky Way stretches across Nut's body, the visible river of stars that the grandmother stories have populated with gods and journeys, with the dead and their transformations. You look up at this sky without electric light and understand what electric light will steal, what the future will forget. The presence of the galaxy itself, the countless suns resolved into a continuous stream, the body of the goddess made manifest in accumulated distant fires. The northern sky holds its imperishable stars, those that never set, that circle the pole in endless rotation, associated with the realm of the afterlife, with the dead who travel at night. The grandmother names these too, the circumpolar ones, the never-dying, the pattern that persists when all else changes, when Soptit drifts in her rising, when the calendar wanders, when the flood comes or does not come. The children finish their game of Senate, the knuckly-bones gathered into a small leather pouch, the board set aside for another evening. They settle closer to the grandmother now, the younger ones leaning against her, the older ones still alert to the stars, asking for names, for stories, for the repetition that will fix these patterns in memory. She gives them what they ask, repeating the names of the decans, the 36 star groups whose heliacal rising occurs at 10-day intervals throughout the year, the system that Egyptian astronomy has developed to mark the hours of the night, to divide the darkness into manageable passage. The decans rise in sequence, each holding sway for 10 days before the next appears, the year turning in their progression, the cycle completing in the 360 days before the epigonal days intervene. The tomb painter has fallen into a doze against the wall, his head tilted back, his eyes closed against the starlight that filters through his lids into dreams already full of darkness. His sleeping arrangements tonight will be simple, a mat on the floor perhaps, or if his position in the royal works affords it, a raised bed with woven string base that lifts him above the insects, above the night's coolness that settles into the lower rooms. Others in the village sleep on simple pallets, on the floor itself, their class determining their elevation, their distance from the earth that receives all bodies eventually. The grandmother's family has mats, has the roof for summer evenings, has the means to gather rather than to scatter into separate exhaustion. Mosquitoes rise from the damp fields beyond the village, from the irrigation channels that water the gardens, and you hear the grandmother speak of burning aromatic herbs to drive them back, the repellents that make sleep possible in the season of their abundance. Someone has already begun this preparation below, and the smell of burning herbs mingles with the smell of burning castor oil, thick and slightly acrid, from the pottery lamp that continues its steady consumption. The combination is not unpleasant, has become familiar through repetition, through the necessity of evening after evening in the hot season when the roof provides refuge and the insects provide trial. The path to the valley lies empty now, the wadi that the workers traverse each dawn awaiting tomorrow's passage. You think of the tomb painter's return, of the scribe's eventual sleep, of the letter drying in the darkness below. The village of Deir el-Medna falls quiet around you, house by house, lamp by lamp, the sounds of evening diminishing into the greater sound of night, the insects, the distant river, the stars themselves in their silence that is not quite silence, that hums at the edge of hearing. A dog barks again, farther now, and is not answered, the boundary of attention withdrawn, the village contracted into itself, into sleep, into the liminal state where the dead travel and the living rest. The grandmother falls silent at last, her stories told, her decans named, the children drowsing against her. You look up at the sky goddess Nut, her body marked with stars, the Milky Way a visible river across her form, and you feel the coolness of night air moving across your skin, still warm from the sun that has been gone for hours now, that will return in its own measured time. The Egyptian civil calendar, with its 365 days, continues its wandering, losing a day against the solar year every 4 years, the drift accumulating, the new year of Soptit's heliacal rising, moving through the seasons in a cycle that will take 1460 years to complete its return. This is longer than memory, longer than the grandmother's stories, longer than the tombs in the valley will preserve their paintings, their Ramesside star clocks with the decans in sequence. The tomb painter dreams of darkness, of the ceilings he has adorned, of the decans he has placed in order for the dead to read. The scribe's letter waits for morning, for the possibility of connection. The children breathe evenly in the starlight, their games finished, their instruction received. The grandmother gazes upward still, her eyes finding the patterns she has named, the Soptit she awaits, the Sar that follows, the Osiris and Isis of stellar mythology written across the darkness. The northern sky holds its imperishable stars, the circumpolar ones, the realm of the afterlife, and she knows, as all in Deir el-Medina know, that sleep brings the living near to this realm, that the night is not empty but full of passage, of transformation, of the dead continuing their journey while the living rest and prepare for dawn. The pottery lamp burns lower, the castor oil consuming itself in light, the linen wick charring at its edge. The smell of burning oil mingles now with the cooler smell of night, of dust settling, of the day's heat finally released into the sky. You taste again the evening bread, still warm from the oven, with its paste of lentils and onion, the meal that sustains through the darkness, that prepares for tomorrow's labor in the valley, tomorrow's copying, tomorrow's small and necessary transactions. The main meal eaten after sunset in hot seasons has fulfilled its function, has gathered the family, has marked the transition from day to night, from labor to rest. The decans continue their rising, the 36 star groups marking the hours in their sequence, the heliacal rising of each occurring at 10-day intervals throughout the year. You watch them appear, the grandmother's instruction making them visible where before there was only scattered light, only the random distribution of distant suns. Egyptian astronomy has given them order, has used them to measure the night, to divide the darkness into hours that can be named, anticipated, endured. The water clocks and shadow clocks that measure night and day hours below, in the temples, in the royal presence, have their origin in this observation, this patience, this willingness to watch and record, to repeat and verify across the years. The sky goddess Nut swallows the sun that has already gone, that continues its journey through her body to be born again at dawn. You stand beneath her arch, feeling the coolness of night air moving, the first breeze after a still day, on skin still warm from sun. The stars in their sky without electric light proclaim her form, the Milky Way a visible river across her body, the decans rising in their sequence, the Soptit that marks the new year and the flood onset, the Sar that is Orion, the Osiris and Isis of stellar mythology. The northern sky with its circumpolar imperishable stars holds the realm of the afterlife, and the dead travel at night, making sleep a liminal state near their realm, a preparation for the longer journey, the greater transformation. The village of Deir el-Medina falls quiet, the path to the valley empty until tomorrow's dawn. The tomb painter dreams his darkness, the scribe's ink dries, the grandmother's stories settle into memory, the children's senate game waits for another evening. The lamps of pottery or stone burn their castor oil or animal fat with linen wicks, the light diminishing as the oil consumes, as the night deepens toward its middle, toward the hours when even the decans seem to pause, when the dead pass closest, when sleep is most profound, most near to that other state, that other journey. The sleeping arrangements vary by class. Mats on floors, raised beds with woven string bases, simple pallets, but all sleep, all rest, all prepare in their different elevations for the labor that returns with light. You feel the final warmth leave the mud brick, the day's heat rising into the darkening sky that has become fully dark now, the stars established in their places, the decans named and moving. The smell of burning aromatic herbs has faded, the mosquitoes driven back or accepted, the breeze that carries the coolness of night air moving across your face, your arms, your skin still warm from sun. The taste of evening bread lingers, the lentils, the onion, the sustenance that will carry through to morning, to the bread that will be baked again, to the cycle that continues, that waits, that prepares, that makes and unmake, and makes again in the pattern that preserves the black land, that fulfills the function of all rest, all dream, all the small and necessary transitions that constitute a civilization's nightly life. The Milky Way arches overhead, the body of nut marked with stars, the decans in their 36 groups, their heliacal rising at 10-day intervals throughout the year, the Egyptian astronomy that has named and ordered them. Soptit rises in her season, the most important star, her heliacal rising marking the new year and flood onset, the Egyptian civil calendar with its 365 days, its 12 months of 30 days, its 5 epigonal days, drifting against the solar year by 1 day every 4 years, the wandering year that persists despite its wandering. The sky goddess Nut arches over the earth, her body marked with stars, the northern sky holding the circumpolar imperishable stars, realm of the afterlife, the dead traveling at night, while the living sleep in their liminal state, near to that realm, preparing for their own eventual journey. The Ramesside star clocks decorate the ceilings of royal tombs with the decans in sequence, the tomb painter's work, the darkness painted to resemble darkness, the stars painted to guide the dead. Water clocks and shadow clocks measure night and day hours, the time divided named, made manageable. The evening is a time of family gathering, the main meal often eaten after sunset in hot seasons, the lamps of pottery or stone burning, castor oil or animal fat with linen wicks, the smell of burning oil marking the hours of light. Sleeping arrangements vary by class. Mats on floors, raised beds with woven string bases, simple pallets, and mosquitoes are a nuisance. Repellents including burning aromatic herbs, the smoke that mingles with lamplight, with starlight, with the darkness that deepens toward morning. A dog's bark carries across fields, answered by another, then silence, the boundaries of the village marked in sound, in sleep, in the stillness that precedes dawn. You stand upon the roof in Deir el Medina, the path to the valley empty until tomorrow's dawn, the grandmother's stories told, the children's game finished, the tomb painter dreaming, the scribe's letter written, the ink drying by the last of the oil. The coolness of night air moves across your skin, still warm from sun, and you taste the evening bread, still warm from the oven, with its paste of lentils and onion, and you smell the burning castor oil, thick and slightly acrid, in the pottery lamp that flickers low, and you look up at the stars in their sky without electric light, the Milky Way a visible river across Nut's body, the decans rising, the Soptit that will come, the Sar that follows, the Osiris and Isis of stellar mythology, the imperishable stars of the northern sky, the realm of the afterlife, the dead traveling, the living sleeping, the night continuing in its measured rhythm, its patient repetition, its preparation for the dawn that will return, that waits, that makes and unmake, and makes again in the cycle that preserves all.